Thank you, everyone. Thank you for organizing this and inviting us. Can you hear us? Can you hear me? Yes, the sound good? Okay. Well, thank you for joining us this morning, afternoon, or in my case, 1 a.m. in Hong Kong. We have something pretty maximalist and relatively provocative to show you, which we've arranged into three interleaved texts that connect ideas around speculative finance, software interfaces, and the relationship between creative consumption and algorithmic feedback. We'll begin with a short preface and some definitions.
Thanks, Roberto. Yeah, I'm gonna start with a little bit of a preface. So, a little bit, whoops, a little bit more on the structure here. Oh, I can't control this for some reason. But hold on just a second here. There we go. Okay. So a little bit more on the structure. Yeah, there's three essentially pieces with this, and they're connected together in all kinds of different complicated ways. We'll go through them linearly. The first two are more theoretical, and the last one is a kind of very fun series of case studies. So I'll begin with a little bit of a preface. So there's a kind of moderation that the smart and cool people in the scene call for with respect to AI, whose position is essentially, actually this stuff is at worst a kind of reflection of ourselves with all the bad stuff included. And for all the possibility it theoretically represents, its extensibility is confined to its reflective capacity. And one of its harsher downstream effects will be our own collective realization of our own mundanity on a larger scale. And the moderate position seems to be very much on target. Already the peak moment of mainstream awe and mainstream terror thus far somehow also happened at exactly the moment that the current generation of deep learning generativity as a service tools started to choke on its own ambitions and churn out hyper smooth baby content consisting of retrenched archetypes, celebrity impersonations, Pixar polarirs, and literally impossible to read marketing copy. The intersection point between awe and choke point is maybe more meaningful than we give it credit. Instead of sulking in front of a mirror that reflects back our own mundanity, LinkedIn, WeChat, Weeaboo, Reddit, Telegram, or TikTok contain a bacchanal celebrating the permutations of our image, drinking in the excesses of ourselves, and in turn, the participants work to craft themselves more strictly in accordance with the logics that encourage the reflective physics of the mirror. The argument that we'd like to make is that there exists a tendency to scope AI as either a totally socially determined technology project, which is wrong, or a product of a pure and unfettered computational discovery, which is wishful thinking. Our sense is that the bottlenecks on the latter have to do with their lingering dependencies on the former, but instead of unraveling this relationship, we are accelerating it. It seems like we are engaging in a collective project of flattening the human into the space of the computable, and specifically like into the kind of low-res, sucky computation we've managed to put together thus far. The commentariat is flush with images of humans spending their time play acting as AI, and this trend has gotten kind of weirder and more literal. But its more subtle permutations are everywhere, circumscribing the territory I call myself with literally hundreds of simultaneous data collection and inference evaluation operations. As I outsource more and more of my cognition to various third-party applets, my conscious experience is fragmenting, ever more subcontracted to the stochastic and arbitrary logics of an absolutely wild form of digital capitalism as it ambivalently plays product manager to a new species of computation. And what's most interesting is that it's the most creative among us leading the charge, reconsuming algorithmic outputs, reinscribing the creatively consumed alternative back into the algorithm, and completing feedback loops of pattern reinforcement, distended and flattened self-recognition, and uncanny mode collapse. If there is a main thesis here, it's that creative reconsumption a la Certeau, détournement a la Guy Debord, or the functions of aesthetics associated with Rancière, the redistribution of the sensible, dissensus, they not only fail in their revolutionary pretensions, but they resemble to a significant degree the iterative Bayesian drift of recommendation algorithms, large language models, and distributed network effects.
So we want to begin by presenting some framing concepts that we'll revisit later in greater detail. The first one is exocapitalism. Capitalism leverages algorithms of varying complexity to sustain itself by generating higher and higher scale market inefficiencies. This appears to be an undirected, involuntary process, and we referred to the autonomy of the process and its distinctness from the world of human affairs as exocapitalism. Lift, the tendency of exocapitalism to wedge abstraction layers between fully virtual capital accumulation processes and material physical operations, including physical commodity production and human social reproduction. Drug, lift, creates weirdness as it intersects with the world of human affairs, in part by decimating the function of labor. Former white-collar laborers create odd performances of labor and invent entire artificial industries to insulate themselves from precarity and add friction to exocapitalism's departure. Game world, a lattice work of software and hardware that trades dopamine and incomplete access to abstract modes of capital accumulation in exchange for model training, data and inference validation, and network effect. The game world represents the umbilical cord tethering the social to the computational, an umbilical cord we feel uneasy about. NPC. The NPC is someone who engages in the performative reconception of game world dynamics. We call them NPCs in that the avenues for performance available to game world participants are largely predefined by the game world. Rasterization. The interface between humans and the game world creates reciprocal loops that result in weird outcomes. NPC performances lead to network effects, which lead to the algorithmic prioritization of certain strata of NPC performances, and the cycle continues. The computational sophistication of game world seems limited in some ways in that there appears to be some relatively stark delineations of what it means to play a game, which leads to feedback. Increasing this resolution might break us out of the loop.
So we'll start with the piece on the relationship between complexity and arbitrage, which kind of repositions capitalism as a more ambivalent actor within the technology sector. And we'll start with the platform. There's a lot of talk about platforms, famously Nick Srinichek and his concept of platform capitalism, which you see developed in his work with Helen Hester or Alex Williams. And, there's an acutely observed tendency towards platform wars. Joshua Citarella does a great job of kind of diffracting this entire narrative, this race to the bottom for a single total Western platform, akin to something like China's WeChat, a total comprehensive marketplace for e-commerce, ideas, political speech, social relations, and games, broadly speaking. But let's start things off with a definition. A platform is principally just a hosted service on which activity occurs. This could be social media, but it could also just as easily be 3D model design, AI model training dashboards, storyboarding tools, teleconferencing technologies. A platform is a frame, an interface, or a surface for commerce. Platforms feel most relevant to global internet culture in terms of their interfacial regimes, their ability to host a world that is entrenched with some kind of psychic dogma handed down by executive teams, shareholders, board members, or the kind of ambient dynamics of Silicon Valley ideology. You can pick your definition. It's very angry Eastern European cousins, or it's hypervigilant siblings in India, Malaysia, China, or Japan. But okay, so here's where we kind of diverge a little bit. When speaking about platforms, especially platforms at scale, we tend to incorrectly attribute to them a monolithic character full of clean lines, intentional decisions, kind of formal and directed social engineering, and a singular static code base. And even a tiny bit of research will uncover the fact that every apparently monolithic platform is instead an absolutely gooey heap of failed experiments, last-minute pivots and random decisions, cruft and technical debt, employee churn and consequent ahistoricity, whole accounting semiologies, and more importantly, modular third-party software as a service components. And in fact, the entire internet of Web 2.0 plus is made up of modular software as a service. The answer to build versus buy is if you can buy it, you buy it. A module is a knot of lean value add, a fungible subcomponent of a platform, a node within a vast fungal network through which all platforms are ultimately interconnected. Our allegation is that the current critical apparatus is really over focusing on platforms, and specifically platforms used to host speech. And we commit a little bit of that sin as well ourselves. But it really under focuses on the underlying reality of modular software as a commercial model, a relationship to value and value add, and most importantly, as a modular architecture built from aggregated vendor services. Software modules are also themselves modular configurations of other third-party software modules. And there becomes really kind of very little distinction between a technical stack and a vendor list. In advanced cases, one's third-party software as a service vendor may actually use you in its stack, making them both a vendor and a consumer, which creates a recursive pool of recurring revenue drift, an eddy, or what Deleuze would call a fold. SaaS is an exercise in creative combinatorics, where the characteristics that distinguish between competitors come from particularized assemblies of modular third-party partners, almost always with massive overlap. So it becomes super difficult to talk about production and consumption. That's a thing we're going to spend a lot of time on today. On one hand, production, we all know that it kind of doesn't really exist apart from a combinatorial exercise anymore. But what's kind of interesting is that consumption is the production process. The vendor consumer loop is literally the process of building and deploying software. So where is labor? Like, what about labor? The cascading modular chain of dependencies turns labor from its last pretenses as some kind of generative action into an embodied relay network. A lot of labor becomes representation work, the linkage of different modules using additional application modules to regulate and host and eventually automate these communications. Apart from that, the only labor that exists within this paradigm is what we will later call creative work, which also consists in representation. Principally, the aesthetic decisions through which a modular assemblage, one of many, is made momentarily whole as a representative of this or that value proposition, which is fundamentally work at the intersection of design and rhetoric. Creative work is the ability to take a streamlined flow of revenue and interpose a value-added node, generating revenue. Here, it feels appropriate to propose the AI stack, which is, sorry to say, literally an assemblage of modular third-party SaaS platforms. The AI stack only places creative work under threat in the last instance. It is, in fact, the only labor upon which software service as an economy has some level of receding dependency. Applying labor theory of value to understand the software economy, let alone contravene it in some way, seems like an incredible waste of time. So buckle up. We're starting with labor theory of value is dead, and we're going to continue from there. Let's talk about arbitrage. Here's a random Google image search graph depicting some Forex trading. I don't know if you know much about Forex exchange, but it consists of about 7.5 trillion USD in daily turnover. Money machines. Let's talk about money machines. So here's one. Step one, and you don't have to understand this. This is all totally over my head as well. Step one, let's identify some volatile sectors or instruments through algorithms like GARCH, ARIMA, or we can use some ML tools like SVM or LDA. Then let's construct a derivative instrument, which is some combination of options, swaps, and futures in order to anticipate and exploit market movements. Let's create a synthetic position that mimics the expected behavior of the underlying asset without actually holding it ourselves, using a mix of long and short positions across different derivatives to construct a highly leveraged bet on future price direction. Use value at risk to pre-allocate capital, running stress tests against the Greeks' underlying asset price, delta volatility, aptly named Vega, time decay, theta, and interest rate changes, or rho. Timing is key. This is where stuff gets like really insane within your HFT platform like Quant Connect or Quant House. Micro time to the millisecond, a chain of optimized entry and exit position points. This involves dynamic rebalancing of your derivative portfolio in response to real-time market data, liquidity conditions, and changing correlations between the underlying assets and the broader market. And then on top of that, use what are called dark pools to mask your trading activity in order to avoid influencing market prices prematurely. Then systematically unwind that position to realize those gains, carefully managing the exit process to avoid slippage, hedge, cover, and pull, baby. You can emulate this as a single proprietor as well. So step one, subscribe to a platform to host a bare bones website, something like Squarespace. Grab that pre-made integration with Shopify or Amazon. Then grab an integration with an image extraction tool that plugs into a direct-to-consumer marketplace for goods produced in a sweatshop with some kind of governor on this integration based on search results. Couple to an integration with a text auto generation tool based on certain search results, and use the free plan of some bullshit integration somewhere with a few generative design tools for basic brand work. Then invest in an integration with an ad set budget optimization, an ABO tool that integrates with TikToks. And then ensure you have in place an integration with a point of sale processor that orders a commodity from the sweatshop marketplace on your behalf and ships it to the customer. And then watch the integration that monitors conversion by campaign and location that feeds back into your ABO tool. Again, you don't have to understand any of that. It doesn't matter. Give me a labor theory of value that explicates this process. Profit is entirely decoupled from production cost or labor hours. It's strictly a function of marketing spend and hosted services spend, SaaS spend. Each step of this process consists in its own vertiginous stack of modular subcomponents at the level of each provider. SaaS modules in hosted services, shipping and logistics, ad tech, generative AI, and social media. Production and labor are entirely in-housed within the sweatshop and not subject to any of this complexity apart from the algorithms that drive volume. And there's zero point of contact between the proprietor and the facility in Bangladesh, let's say, a relationship that's principally a geopolitical relationship and therefore subject to a scale of intricacy beyond any contributor's conceptual capacity, let alone agential scope. Okay, one last example here. Buy some Litecoin at X dollar value on Binance, then transfer that Litecoin with a transfer service to something sketchy like AIM by Crypto, a secondary market with a variably higher Litecoin rate. Then transfer the exchange back to Binance and repeat. But don't stop there. Capture this principle, the literal one time it works on video, and use it to further increase your percent commission on conversion with your existing affiliate partnership with AIM by Crypto. Plop that content on YouTube, and then develop a course on Gumroad that kind of advertises your affiliate marketing success and sell it to 15-year-olds. They're all going to make it too. On top of that, build an empire of meta courses for affiliate marketing coaches, of social media managers, of exclusive content producers on OnlyFans, Fansly, Patreon, etc. Capitalism has never had any interest in market efficiencies. It is a cascading fountain of arbitrage. The market iterates newer and newer inefficiencies, and revenue flows downstream from inefficiency only, and it is used to motivate the innovation of new inefficiencies and folds. And further, the chain of hosted service modules used to string this all together intensifies and sustains the types of friction, time delay, and complexity from which arbitrage can emerge. Capitalism has no interest in market-based solutions to human need. Also never has and never will. It instead spawns meta economies of pure and abstract automation in itself, dissolving and decoupling the tethers between capital and its material conditions. So if you can remember one thing about this insane talk, it becomes imperative to conceive of a capitalism that is detaching, lifting off, and departing from the immediate sphere of human events. The line is, capitalism doesn't need us anymore. Going more. Let's talk about what we're calling lift. So Deleuze and Guattari identify capitalism with a rhythm of abstraction and subsequent redefinition, the quote, twofold movement of decoding, the deterritorializing flows on one hand, and their violent and artificial reterritorialization on the other. And of course, the generic Marxian critical lens focuses on that latter component, the plow going back into the soil, and we have our disciplinary and control societies, we have labor exploitation, and we have the focusing of desire. But it is instead through Suhail Malik, the delocalization and dematerialization gesture, the lifting from the earth, the holographic reinscription of matter into pure relationality, that what we call exocapitalism gets its characteristic adaptability from. And we really think Malik gets this right. Capitalism is an abstraction machine. Abstraction doesn't just mean commodification, especially in a post-commodity world. Hopefully everyone here knows that airlines are banks, right? Like flights are actually lost. Like no airline makes money on you flying on their airline. But revenue flows from point allocation and credit card partnerships, right? Pharmacies are speculative arbitrage regimes coupled directly to the insurance industry, which is fundamentally a banking industry, right? Restaurants, the successful ones, are speculative real estate companies that lease intellectual property. banks are becoming meta banks, and those meta banks unspool into this accordion fold of pure financial speculation that we were just discussing. So a chain of deferral expands between business and customer, and B2C goes to B2B to B2B to B2B to B, all the way around to themselves. So we'd like to propose this concept of lift. Instead of the vertical integration all the way into the land we expected in the 70s, we're seeing a kind of hovering. Lift represents the imperative to move away from the soil, from physical capital and human labor, from commodity production and single-use purchase. Now, many people could argue this is just because of business need, right? Through the principle of leanness, the idea that it's good to outsource low margin, hard to maintain, expensive, politically charged, physically remote activities. Move those away. But we argue that this concept of leanness is a kind of libidinal repackaging of the real way that value is constructed through chains of abstraction, complexification, friction, and consequent arbitrage. Lift hollows out a cavity between material conditions and operational systems by wedging abstraction layers in between the two, packing in third-party layers with such density that a black hole of information loss emerges, so that there's no connection between material labor and managerial meta process. And it begins with outsourcing. Sure. And outsourcing to chains of local providers that became increasingly enmeshed with local governments and other non-commercial entities. But Lyft also just involves the addition of value-added intermediaries prior to that gesture of outsourcing. And this occurs simultaneously with the fact that the real parts of a given business have been pivoting hard away from commodity production in general. And you could say, for the last 20 years, for the last 40 years, maybe forever, right? Like maybe that is the kind of originary germ here. So you can describe the global economy in a number of different ways, and we're kind of committing the sin of inventing a new kind of capitalism, which is a very cringe thing to do. And there's neoliberal capitalism, there's speculative capitalism, semio-capitalist capitalism, cognitive capitalism, digital capitalism, platform capitalism, influencer capitalism, whatever. But these are traits that describe precisely the least stable and most fleeting aspects of the present global economic situation. Instead, the modern global economic model has remained strictly and execrably a feudal and even slave economy from which an abstraction machine hatched and is in the process of departing. This prior economy continues unabated and even invigorated, with humanity's reproductive operations from resource extraction to textiles to care work to agricultural labor to manufacturing, largely exercised through coercion, operated by those largely excluded from what has become to be understood as the human, right? And we make the most important mistake when we invent a dependency of that latter economy upon the former, let alone conflate the two. But here's where we kind of depart a little bit from Suhail Malik's narrative. And yeah, this is a complicated point for us. Like power, pick your definition, just feels like the wrong word to assign to capital. I know. There's a kind of apophenia or folk ontology we apply to things that move randomly at titanic or tectonic scales, wherein the compression of this activity to human scales imbues it with meaning and intention. And while it's important, like critical to recognize the downstream implications of power, we would argue that it's duly important to recognize that power is more likely thrown up by the apophenic process, by militant pattern recognition apparatus applied to the arbitrary collision of tectonic forces with thousands, if not millions, of years of accumulated momentum. And I'll touch upon this later, but like, man, if there's one thing I really believe in, it's that we really, really need a theory of scales and scaling problems. So one last little bit of this for me before we start to get into games and NPCs and human performance, but this is kind of a segue into the performance component. So as exocapitalism takes off, launching into weirder, smaller, and more arcane inefficiencies through which to pipe revenue, the human is kind of left behind, like grabbing at its balloon strings, trying to tether it back down to our frame of reference. And I'll use the word drag super intentionally here to represent this grasping motion in both senses of the term. Drag literally in the sense of adding friction to some moving object, in this case, retarding the lift process, but also drag in that it involves a rich, complex performance. Instead of labor, the performance of labor, which does involve quite a bit of extraordinarily alienated effort. Instead of production, representation. I think that's a really critical shift. I call this creative labor, and that is a labor of comprehensive invention, a labor of world construction. Now, here my kind of like history as a failed artist really kind of kicks in. So, we often identify creative labor as its own specific practice with its own specific economy, right? You have an artist spackling together a sculpture or a musician jamming in a dimly lit club, but the sculpture making or the drumming is, if anything, a kind of externality thrown up by its proprietors through the course of what is fundamentally a conventional advertising business, events marketing, affiliate marketing, or an educational enterprise, the ad tech tutorial shiller to adjunct professor to local music teacher spectrum. And these artistic flares, what we've called creative labor in the past, is often more of an experience one pays for as a tax deductible loss. Being an artist is a thing you pay to do while sustaining your social media marketing gig, or if you're quite good at art, your fintech operation, to which artwork is collateral. Instead, I'd rather argue that most conventional white collar office work under our image of a departing autonomous exocapitalism has a super underexplored creative valence to it. At the surface level, this is clear just given the value with which, say, neoliberal capitalism places value on nominally creative gestures. You have your disruption, innovation, reinvention, whatever. But it's rather the kind of social aspects of white collar office life through which new worlds are built and sustained. What distinguishes one software company from another software company apart from the creative practice of value construction, or one sneaker brand from another sneaker brand that has gone through a identical supply chain apart from creative value injection in the last instance? What distinguishes our marketplace from another apart from public facing world construction? As the commodities we produce become more and more arcane and weird, less and less useful, more and more fictitious in terms of their actual autonomy as commodities, the world constructive task gets harder and harder, requiring more, all the mega quotes in the world, creativity. The drive to total monopoly, the drive to hold and sustain the entire world, is also a drive towards de-differentiation. And I love how Nick Cernicek talks about this, the convergence thesis, which is the idea that different platforms that are trying to get bigger and bigger, they converge. They become increasingly similar as they encroach upon the same market and data areas. The difference making between Meta, Amazon, and Google, all data aggregators, ad sellers, and digital marketplaces, blurs into a kind of creative world constructive exercise despite the trend towards monopolistic characteristics. And here's where we diverge again from people like Cernicek. Despite that kind of apparent monopolism, there exists such rich and chaotic interiorities to spaces like Alphabet that attributing concepts of hegemony or monopoly to these organizations feels like the wrong word. Certainly, these companies, quote, own the infrastructures of society. That's a Cernicek quote. But as each company lays claim to the world, the ownership of a world by a world that bears world scale complexity, feels tautological. Creative differentiation doesn't begin and end with a designer who spins logos and deck templates. The world building chain occurs when you have a CEO creating mission statements, you have a CRO constructing positioning and objection handling, a CPO with a behavioral typology of employees. There's a reason it's called a performance evaluation. You have a mid-level manager distributing narratives of belonging. You have an accountant developing an entire semiology. You have a technician or an engineer aggregating fungible software or hardware components in unique combinations. You have shop floor employees fabulating narratives of their own positions in all of this to their career, their life purpose, their aspirations, be it affirmatively or in obstinate opposition. All of this effort is assembled into a bundle and placed at an altar for a fictional image of capitalism, one based on legacy consumption production paradigms, individual wealth aggregation, labor produced value. Obviously, this is nothing new, but we're putting this all there to say, hey, we're working here. We're doing capitalism too. The idea, sorry, now I'm getting like kind of snippy. The idea that a labor-driven economy exists, now that takes creativity. All right, I'm going to pass this on to Roberto now for a section on economies of affect and game mechanics or game dynamics. Sorry, Roberto.
Thank you. So, as Marek was pointing out, exocapitalism as an abstraction machine liberated from anthropocentric constraints represents a xenomorphic fractal that thrives in the alienated terrains beyond human comprehension, and tethering, a detachment, a lifting, a departure from the sphere of human events. Now, the zeitgeist of social criticism has evolved morphing into a multifaceted dissection of capitalism's manifestations, its effects, from the relentless temporality of a 24/7 operational mode, thinking here of Curry or Kornblue, to the digital feudalism of platform capitalism, Nietzsche, from the commodification of science and cognition, thinking of Berardi or Muriel-Boutang, to the reconfiguration of labor's essence, thinking of Terranova or Helen Hester. Yet, such critiques merely gaze the surface of a far more profound and unsettling transformation. And what I propose here is strategic retreat into the primal forces that animate the very fabric of these metamorphoses, that is, the economies of effect. The forces that fueled classical and specially organized modernity involved a rearrangement of the affective and productive dimensions of labor and subject formation, Bavarian disenchantment, the gradual evaporation of magic from the everyday, leaving behind a world desaturated of emotion, motivation, and fulfillment. This process was eventually counterbalanced by the emergence of what Andreas Rekvich, among others, defines as the creativity dispositive. In the creativity dispositive, creativity is not a semantic phenomenon, but an organizing principle. It is a mode of aestheticization. It links the aesthetic with specific non-aesthetic formats or complexes of practices. Here, the aesthetic is used to refer, through its etymological root, to esis, or sense of perception, and more precisely to the concept of aesthetic perception. Stemming in modern discourses from the Kantian consideration of disinterested pleasure, aesthetic perception melts the purely sensual, sensorial with the affective or the emotional. And by doing so, it moves from the intrasubjective into the intersubjective or social domain. The creativity dispositive countered the de-aestheticization of existence linked to the totalizing, secularized, rationalist processes that had guided the development of both forms of modernity. Their preference for more. Did I drop there? Maybe I dropped.
Yes. I was just about to say something. Yeah, but you're back.
I am back, yeah? I don't know where I dropped. So I was discussing the idea of the creativity dispositive, and we were talking about how pervasive social processes of aestheticization become densely affect and motivation generative and linked to the sensual rather than the transcendental, thinking of religion here, or to an attempt at perfecting society, like in the case of politics. As a result, the aesthetic became an alternative to the rational and the moral, promising to overcome the structural lack of affection and the creativity dispositive, which emerges from the blueprint of artistic modernism, its most powerful crystallization. The dispositive has long been institutionalized through the development of aesthetic economies, the spread of new aesthetic objects, and a new creatively self-shaped subjectivity. Psychology, through its attention to creativity from within, and mass media, through its expansion of creativity from without, have played a crucial role in this process. So, what we have here is, that creativity has become the focal point of a whole range of social imperatives, an alter value of post-capitalist processes. The creativity dispositive unfolded from new aestheticized modes of socialization that combined four critical elements. First, subjects as creators. Second, an aesthetic audience, and that is linked to compulsive aesthetic appropriation. Third, aesthetic objects, that is artifacts or objects used with aesthetic intent. For example, nowadays we have four platforms like Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, Artbreeder, or DALL-E that produce on average 20 million images per day. And four, an institutionalized regulation of attention from the market through media to the state. These processes relate to the greater predominance of inter-objective over intersubjective relationships and the apparent replacement of rule-guided by creative action. Social interactions that prioritize aesthetic experiences have shifted from a niche reality, thinking here of probably the late 19th century, into a widespread counterculture, thinking of cultural scene after World War II, and eventually into a pervasive form of social governance that influences cultural norms and behaviors. The pervasive mobilization of artistic practices has the performance of creativity and not the production of artworks, and ultimately the production of the self as an aesthetic object as its only goal. The drive towards novelty mutates, transitioning from the archaic cycle of obsolescence to a relentless self-reinvention, culminating in a detached, non-linear cascade of uniform excitations. An spectator ingested by the spectacle of hyperproductivity, a society captive within the web of continuous, aestheticized sensory overload. The economy of attention becomes capital in a society overexposed to novelty, to uninterrupted aestheticized sensorial stimuli, to an exhaustion of the possibility of the new, a paradoxically concurrent class of too much and not enough innovation. Creativity has now become, you may say, a repetitive compulsion, neutralized affect injection. It masquerades as utopian anesthesia, a force liquefying and flattening the human condition, oblivious to the exocapitalist schema of disengagement. As non-player characters in this exo-narrative, individuals become passive onlookers, praising creativity as the gateways to self-sovereignty. Creativity invokes the effect of agency without effective capacity, an infrastructure for the mitigation of alienation without producing agency. Exocapitalism at the human level is a creative economy in which further virtualizations and faults are rewarded with the effect of creativity. So far we have discussed some key concepts that are central to our approach to the being NPC phenomenon, sketching out a preliminary cosmology of a lifting capitalism. Yeah, we've talked about platforms, SaaS, the game world matrix, exocapitalism as a cascade of arbitrage mechanisms, economies of creation and effect, self-mirroring overdose, and the machinic origami of abstraction. These concepts are tethered by a common substrate of interfaces, or what we prefer to term as interfacial regimes, a term that Marek has already introduced. We conceive interfaces as relational modes of synthesis, gateways enabling us but also exceeding the flux between heterogeneous system layers, acting as spaces of technological relationality that challenge binary constructs. Thinking here of, for example, virtual real, organic, inorganic, detachment, augmentation. As such, interfaces, we would say, serve as mediation complexes, spaces of transformation, and also conduits of control that guide the mutual relationships and metamorphosis of the engaging entities. Crucially, interfaces manifest through fractal, self-contained expansions and contractions that are apparent in every single process, at least to the extent that it represents the immanent outside of the in-between of the systems. The following list recontextualizes interfacial regimes within the previously explored concepts. The symbiosis between mid-space and platform infrastructures mediated by algorithmic regimes that contribute to the compression of the human experience. The soft assembled interfaces framing the related subcontracting of conscious experience to digital capitalism. SaaS as modular configurations and platforms as cryptic input-output matrices with obscured randomized processing cores. The cascading arbitrage that fuels the vertical perpetuity of market ecologies. The spectral hand of capitalist abstraction and its ensuing chains of deferment. The creativity apparatus and its entanglement in institutionalized networks of aesthetic sociality. Content marketing and the linked exchange of dignity for visibility. Game dynamics in general and the cancerous proliferation of the game world. The digitization, quantization, and computation writ large. We argued that these threads converge to reveal a stratification or layerization, as sometimes termed in computational studies, of interfacial regimes, governed by an algorithmic disintegration of streams into stochastic and arbitrary logics. The outcome is an increasing opacity in the traceability of actions and a linked narrowing of the agential scope and effective capacity to the smallest level of the increasingly constrained individual event, with no upstream resonance. Exocapitalism in its voracious expansion, feasts upon nonlinear intricacies that preclude the direct abstraction of cause from effect. It dissolves linearities into the dark matter of complexity. This, we argue, represents a Saturn downscaling of the human into low-res models, only counterable by a resolution scaling, a quantum leap in computation on hardware in the form of a non-agentic lateral move. In their Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari explain, and I quote here, how the death of a social machine has never been heralded by a disharmony or a dysfunction. On the contrary, social machines make a habit of feeding on the contradictions they give rise to, on the crises they provoke, on the anxieties they engender, on the infernal operations they regenerate. Schizocapitalism mobilizes desire, creates incessant demands for novelty, and perpetuates and feeds from cycles of destruction and creation that both liberate and enslave individuals. And it does so through increasing sophistication in the extraction of tradable value at the interface level. But as the system folds into greater levels of abstraction, the schizoid dynamics of the model's behaviors are critically enhanced and transformed, diverting into alternative machinic channels. Against the ubiquitous fractality of interfacial regimes, what some scholars have defined as the interface within the interface, we face an untethering exocapital lifting, as Marek was pointing out earlier, that represents a bridge of the interfacial host to parasite status, a black hole of alienation between material labor and managerial meta-processes. The question remains, how can the non-agentic move manifest? First, it must recognize that exocapitalism cannot be effectively countered by elevating individual agency or creativity alone. It demands instead an integrated, systemic response woven from the fabric of the system itself, a profound upscaling of current low-res models allowing for a more comfortable coexistence. This means an adjustment of human circumstance. Let us discuss a little bit agency in more detail now. The exploration of agency, from the discussion of voluntary action in the Nicomachean ethics to its networked examination in the actor network theory, ANT, and through its, several historically and economically contingent definitions, has been linked to discussions of autonomy, free will, decision-making, intentionality, and most importantly to us, of causality, that is the traceability of action, which is a key aspect in ethical or legal accountability. In modernist discourses, the factualization of such traceability mirrors what we could term as the quantization hype. This trend traces its origins back to the 19th century with the advent of new paradigms in scientific measurement. We are thinking here of tools such as the anthropometer, craniometer, stethoscope, dynamometer, and it extends to today's widespread datafication and computational processes. Thinking here, of health and fitness tracking, social interaction tracking, work and productivity metrics, finance and behavior tracking, education and learning analytics, and so on. And this highlights a shift towards a more rationalized and virtualized modes of production, and the same in the case of social exchange. Agency has been thus reduced to a matter of measurement, to a quantifiable variable now determined through comparative statistical analysis of stacked synchronous and asynchronous processes. Building upon this foundation, it becomes essential to re-evaluate this model beyond doxastic conservatism by reconnecting agency with the notion of effective capacity. And by that, we refer to the ability to enact some response within a given dynamic system. We argue that as we witness an increasing narrowing of the agential scope following the computational turn, creativity has been flattened into an infrastructure for the mitigation of alienation, unable to produce agency. Alienation speaks to an agential gap, to a shrinking of the effective capacity, and that agential gap speaks both to the limited possibilities of action defined by the linked interfacial regimes, and to creativity as a failed attempt at its mitigation. This leads to a sense of withdrawal, As the human moves from the pulsating heart of the game, you could say as a subjective node in cybernetic feedback loops, to the periphery, where it assumes the guise of a spectral onlooker, drifting into the void, an observer at the edge of a self-sustaining, impersonating, mirroring, and mocking ecosystem. As the matrix of game dynamics surrounding us expands and the internal logics of the system become increasingly elusive, we recede into NPC roles. We become mere spectators in alien landscapes. This points, we believe, to a critical phase shifting in human history, to an apparent breach of the ubiquitous fractality of the interface. Sorry. Now, the fragmentation and subcontracting of conscious experience that we are currently witnessing stands in reciprocal relation to the compulsive repetition of vacuous novelty that underpins the creativity dispositive, which has been partially channeled through the recurrent abstraction processes and modular stacked configurations of platforms and SaaS structures. These connect through extensive gamification the economies of affect to the game world, embedding attention and motivation into the force scheme sustaining such a model. Dopamine farming, behavioral addiction, low attention span, social networking, indefatigable TikTok feeds, constant craving, immediate gratification, etc. All of this points to dimensions of the NPC traits that we discussed earlier. As in the case of other compulsive behaviors, an abnormal enhancement of the Pavlovian incentive learning enables game-related stimuli to acquire abnormal dopamine releasing properties. This creates circuits that connect pleasure with stimuli, leading to habituation and increasing levels of anhedonia, that is, the inability to experience pleasure. Such a process may result in what medical research identifies as prefrontal striatal loops, which are associated with deficits in impulse control and decision-making due to the pivotal role of dopamine in incentive arousal and its impact on motivation and action. But dopamine loops, the challenge, achievement, reward mechanisms scientifically linked to its release, point to modes of behavioral tailoring that have more to do with sociology or anthropology than with scientific discourse. Behavioral policing is part of this gameplay, which has become an alien playground within this planetary right of the Tethering, in an attempt at integrating into the arbitrary logics of this digital capitalism. The human, now a voyeur in the game world, play acts as AI, remains unnoticed, drugs, reconsumes game world dynamics. But the game is a downsampling machine, a mosaic blur. So we would say that the game world is a matrix built upon the game concept. Since Huizinga's Homo Ludens, the idea of the magic circle, which implies the creation of a temporary world separate from the ordinary, has been redefined as a system, and I'm quoting here Tekimbas and Zimmerman, in which players engage in rule-based artificial conflict with quantifiable outcomes. Today, the game world represents a conflation of the ordinary and the magic, the end of the artificiality of the game domain, and the increasing inaccessibility of the rules of a game stack transformed into a recursive mechanism, an end in itself. This transformation is illustrated in the era of exocapitalism by the exploitation of gamification, that is, integration of game dynamics into non-game contexts, as a key tool for recursive virtualization, data collection, and model testing. This shift has led to an unparalleled expansion of the game domain, now a critical form of symbolic recombination that supports the ritual apparatuses of contemporary society. Here, economies of affect re-emerge as motivational affordances, offering the illusory opportunity to validate and affirm the integrity of our personal motivations and interconnected belief systems. Yet, the liberty for voluntary participation and the freedom of engagement have been supplanted by an impulse towards control. Gamification has morphed into a form of soft power, that transcends mere coercion, cultivating complicit individuals. Power manifests as a non-linear mechanism for shaping subjects through disciplinary strategies. Gamification, as such, intersects with our perceptions of fun as false consciousness and the concepts of play. On the one hand, gamification signifies the reincorporation of fun into the circuits of capitalism. As Adorno and Horkheimer put it a few decades ago, amusement in late capitalism is the prolongation of work. On the other hand, the notion of labor, the gamified implosion of play and labor, acts as a catalyst for innovation and productivity, striving to re-enchant both production and consumption in a false attempt to mend the rift originally exacerbated by organized modernity. As stochastic developments unfold in the digital space of exocapitalism, layers accrete along the complex surfaces of abstraction and recursion, revealing every platform as nothing more than a folded marketplace. In this, games and gameplay are not just pastimes, but the fundamental value creation and exchange mechanisms, channeling the subcontracting of human cognitive threads for data aggregation and validation in exchange for dopamine. A game world feeding from feedback loops of algorithmic determination and reuptake. The game interface as an endless fold through chains of deferral. Game worlds in real worlds, in game worlds, in real worlds, in game worlds, in real worlds. A dizzying verticality of cascading virtualizations and abstractions.
Awesome. Just laughing to myself about Adorno and Horkheimer calling anything late capitalism, half a century ago. It feels good. Okay, so we're moving on to the case studies component of the talk, which is the last of the third big chunks. And it's a little bit lighter and a little bit more fun, but also a little bit more kind of exemplifying in all these concepts that we've been throwing around. So when we talk about NPC, we're talking about a type of feedback loop, right? Being NPC is a type of behavior. First, this reconsumption, détournement, embellishment, pantomime, parody, embodiment, cosplay, or just general performance as or of artificial intelligence, however kind of locally understood by human actors, social groups, or institutions. But we're further referring to a recursive chain of modeling and model of modeling, what Roberto was speaking about, enacted both by humans and by various game dynamics, followed by further acts of self-recognition and reperformance, downsampling. These chains tend to intensify, bringing to the picture weirder and more specific models, followed and anticipated by weirder and more specific modes of self-recognition and reconsumptive performance. As these chains spin out, they seem to limit some plateaus as defined by the parameters of available play within the game world, concentrating around the parameters of those borders. And then the performative or expressive modes available to a person, and thus both the means of human interpolation and identification, start to contract, or at least ossify into a kind of passive spectatorship with various uncanny models starting to unfold across the body. As cognition becomes more and more subcontracted by various simultaneous game playing obligations, experience begins to recede as well. So that's essentially a recap of the last section that we were just discussing. And maybe a final note, kind of framing the NPCs before we start to build some categories. We are talking it should be obvious to everyone that the NPC kind of emerged as a social thing from a kind of far right meme, referring precisely to this kind of passivity. But we're borrowing a little bit of spice from that, but really taking it from the world of video games, in which there exists actually a huge affirmative, beautiful, poetic space of what it means to both perform and non-perform in a well-traced, iteratively defined, and completely dynamic environment. Oops, just push this here. Okay, so Roberto.
Yes, so we're going to introduce a taxonomy of NPCs, and the following is just a brief and incomplete list of NPC classes and traits. A part of a game world ambience, an environmental object, a passive or silent resident within a house, or a fixture within an overworld. A troll patrolling a fixed grid line with a fixed line of sight, who charges when activated. a swarm intelligence constructed to represent the appearance of enemy tactics, while in fact intelligently inferencing opportunities for its own defeat. An idiotic companion who eagerly receives orders, a chatty squadmates who you wish you could send to its death, but are rule-bound to keep alive. An archetype of a character or a character class, a specific mode of play that is assignable to a player or a non-player. A merchant who has never left the inside of their store, a collector of wares, whose pricing is variable based on their location with respect to the game's narrative arc, a consumer of local drama or history, a chatterbox, a game runner, a tavern keeper, a provincial villager. A guide to a game world, a wise old man in a cave, someone who gives you something important, someone you follow through a maze. A game attempting to perform recognizable humanity, a moment of wit, fourth wall breaking, ironic meta commentary, a developer reaching across time, a fissure in a game logic that reinscribes the immersion of the game world. A trickster, a mask salesman, an ambivalent but canny creature unbound by the physics of the game, a demon, a cruel fortune teller, a shrewd negotiator. A bundle of incomprehensible text or characters, an alien totem or an unintelligible signpost, an encounter with an error, a mini-boss, a boss, a dreadnought, a dying soldier drawing attention to its wounds, a critically injured townsperson begging for a quick death, searchable or unsearchable remains, a burnt corpse, a flayed skeleton, a skull. And finally, a non-player in the literal sense, a refusal to play the game, an aborted session turned into a ragdoll, a keyboard left unattended, a product of profound lag, someone standing by just waiting to be killed. These are all defined in contradistinction to a player character, who is never really seen or understood, whose motivations are absent or abstracted, who is often trying to remember something, who is often constructed out of various modular components at the game's onset, and therefore has no distinct identity. So, here's the case study number one, the biohacker. Now, with each loop, we underline a feedback relationship between algorithmic determination and creative reuptake. And we'll start with two loops based around the quantization of the subject. For loop one, let's take the body and heave it into the game space. The goal is clear, maximalization. Hard to get more specific than that. Maybe longevity, maybe physical tone or ideal weight, maybe an HDL ratio. All well and good, but even those specifics ultimately point to an ambiguous concept of health or wellness that's grounded in the maximalization of productivity, intention, or energy. This is already, a displacement of one's objectives from the body to the ability of the body to operate in some unspecified but ideal capacity. The body here becomes a game board, a game piece, a stratified verticality of different simultaneous games and game operations. Ultimately, game objectives like the accomplishment of a given target or streak or trend, tangible goals directly coupled to dopamine, replace the intangible objectives of health or wellness in themselves. The biohacker dominates the body through time restriction, schedule activities, documentation, and abstention. The body is not only the site of biohacker games, the entire temporality of the body is injected with game-ridden intention. Mealtime involves the quantization of nutrients and macros delivered at specific time periods within time-delimited windows. A Lindy walk involves a step count during an optimal fat burn period. Sleep itself is colonized by its 4 stages and the activities preceding and anteceding it. It actually becomes possible to win at sleeping. Now, all of these activities are at first rigorously documented, thinking here of manual entry or this or that macronutrient, this or that lift. But then, as they become automated, They become replaced with a kind of over-eager watchfulness. You watch the app track your blood glucose while you eat. You check in your automatic step counter while you're walking. You monitor your heart rate during a run. Yeah. The biohacker gradually recedes into a kind of spectator, watching the automated watcher while proceeding to execute a series of rigidly third-party designated activities that fully quantize the biohacker's experience, not just of their body, but of time. A puzzle piecing of pre-scheduled necessities and of the world, an array of quantifiable risk metrics that introduce painful contingency into an otherwise winnable game. The intensification pathway of the biohacker follows a few intersecting trajectories. First, medtech spins out some obviously, useful platforms designed to lower insurance premiums. These platforms quickly become gamified. Easy dopamine production, outsourcing of active cognitive management of bodily functions. Network effects lead to weirder and more arcane integrations with the body, which are reconsumed as more abstract paradigms of physical optimization, from disease prevention as a negative category, to health as a neutral category, to wellness as an abstract and intangible optimization level. See also Arcteryx wearer, geriatric millennial anus sunner.
Yeah, shout out to all my anus sunners out there. We'll go on to another loop here. This is the second loop, the acronomologist. Sorry, it's going to get a little based, but it'll come back. Don't worry. So for the acronomologist, the personal is the political to the extent that the personal is actually constituted by an array of sociopolitical orientations enumerated into a lattice of prescriptions. In turn, the mobility of the personal is limited to the tidal motion of this or that discursive space as splayed out on Twitter or Tumblr or various downstream IRL communities. The personal is played out through the political, and that the sphere of social relations outside of the scales conventionally considered to be political becomes subject to the ordinances of higher scale activity, what Badiou might call realism. So you have a relationship between an American tenant and a landlord that is mediated by positions with respect to the conflict in Ukraine, or you have a relationship between a father and a daughter redrawn into position taking with respect to a presidential candidate, or a new friendship. This happened to me recently. A new friendship is forged through statements of mutual commitment to the ambiguous concept of liberation. Conversely, the political is played out through the personal, and that every tragedy, geopolitical stance, or legal determination, no matter the scale of remoteness, is reinscribed at the individual scale and re-expressed as personal experience. These personal experiences are super intense, right? They drastically exceed the mundanity of our individual scale or local life in their dramatic scope and their traumatic affect. Intensity then promotes a reprioritization of experience in which fantastical geopolitical experience is positioned prior to local scale experience in both immediacy and priority. This scale collapse triggers a crazy collapse of political space. I hope everyone's watching this really closely in their world, right? Because intersubjective relationships are rewritten through the highest scales of political activity. Only local politics becomes only about position taking with respect to these highest scales. American city councils spend time issuing non-binding geopolitical resolutions. Local representatives become flattened representations of higher scale political figures, and local legislation is reinterpreted through the hermeneutics of position taking with respect to larger scale political movements. The local scale of political activity empties out into a vacuum, quickly subsumed by the arbitrary, and I really mean arbitrary, motions of commerce, which is always taking all sides at once into a kind of random consideration. So you get a feedback loop, and it escalates between the forces of interpolation and identification. The personal recedes into, at best, a kind of dramatization of higher scale activity, children play acting as superheroes in the opening scene of a Marvel movie, or at worst, a kind of hapless spectatorship to inaccessibly higher scale activity, which, let's be honest, for most Westerners takes place online, whose downstream impact is often difficult to determine. The intensification pathway of the acronomologist follows a few intersecting trajectories. First, you have game avatars that consist of category and degree assignments. You have your bios, personal pages, your entry surveys when you're starting a new SaaS module, whatever, and reaction paradigms, the obvious ones being quote, stitch, retweet, grid, forward, etc. Games actively promote high engagement behavior around social or political disagreement. This, of course, is obvious to anybody. But the scope of social and political identity play explodes with hard epistemological stances and moral claims at the highest scales engaged at all times. This creative identity play mimics the value add motion of modular application development, in which layers of complexity are introduced not at the top in a kind of arborescent growth, but on the insides of relationship graphs. Stances flow downworld to meet space with IRL implications. You can lose your job, you can lose your wife, you can lose your father, which further entrench positioning, as we all know. And the feedback loop between creative identity construction and entrenchment leads to a human being that is somehow both capital A geopolitical superhuman agent, but also totally alone in the specificity of their categorical self-determination. See also Black Square Poster, Tenderqueer, or MAGA Chud. All right, we got some requests for TikTok in the chat, so we're going TikTok land pretty quick. So here are two more loops that are really interconnected. This is that of the hustlepreneur and the scammer. So as exocapitalism pushes away, the next three case studies are built around emulatory performances of arbitrage. So the hustlepreneur oozes growth mindset. Like the biohacker, the hustlepreneur pursues maximization, but of the mind, not of the body. Revenue is generated simply due to the application of the right patterns of cognition, because as we all know, money is an energy that follows the laws of attraction. The hustlepreneur practices some of the most aggressive opt-in to game world, devoting themselves to the mastery of game dynamics and game playing strategies. Now, you can say or you can think that the hustlepreneur is a consumer throwing money at Capital Club, or I don't know if you guys know Andy Elliott, the six-pack guy, Let's Go to War in 2024 memberships. But they are, also straight up housing self-improvement books and podcasts that largely consists of lists of other personal development books and podcasts. But it's a mistake to think of these people as consumers only, because the hustlepreneur is much more like a bot, much more generative than actually consumptive. They engage in autolytic Pac-Man-like bot behavior by commenting, "Let's do this," and interested to solicit more information from LinkedIn scammers, shilling secret sales techniques or investment advice or real estate hotspot maps. The hustlepreneur is always connecting, right? They are doing the boots on the ground labor of platforms like LinkedIn, routing arbitrary pathways of low touch relationships between relatively random people, testing the limits of network effect by spinning these filigree thin webs from ChatGPT generated solicitations to, definitely all second level, but even third level connections. It follows that the hustlepreneur speaks and acts like a bot, copying and pasting generative text to inferenced locations. And to an observer, creating absolutely amazing, beautiful, poetic, hilarious threads of nonsensical affirmations all over each other's content for reach and follow. The hustlepreneur fucking loves AI and is overwhelmingly its biggest use case in terms of raw user base. Now, there's a predator out there for the hustlepreneur, which is the scammer, a low-level hustlepreneur who's left Palatown or is in Viridian City, often encounters a low-level scammer early in their journey at the second or third village who takes their money and runs. The shame of this encounter creates a germ of frustration with the hustlepreneur's own idealism that, upon maturation, ultimately pushes the hustlepreneur to evolve into a scammer themselves. The scammer gives no fucks. From level 1 Bipper to level 30 supplement empire owner, the scammer understands that arbitrage is everything, that price is ultimately a hyper-local phenomenon thrown up only at the point of sale. The scammer might play around with more speculative forms of arbitrage like crypto, but actually tends to be quite conservative with intangible assets because the scammer is an advanced practitioner of contingency. The scammer traffics in volume, practicing a shotgun spray and see what sticks methodology. Excellent at white labeling noise, the scammer can white label anything and resell, leveraging an advanced, highly generative ad tech tool chain to generate cults and keep customer acquisition cost, his only overhead, to a minimum. The intensification pathway of these two figures follows these kind of intersecting trajectories. So first, the problem of white collar labor, right? It becomes more and more visibly unstable in its decoupling from the value chain. Even agile corporate structures are too inflexible to adapt to the micro markets that breed around various abstract hypervolatilities and inefficiencies. For those means, going it alone becomes a solid working paradigm, intersecting with a neoliberal motion towards sole proprietor contract labor. Epistemological instability and economic precarity engenders a strong need for framework development. Man, how many people have you encountered who are pursuing frameworks at all costs? I'm one of them, unfortunately. Predator and prey relationships develop between commercial segments. Both scammers and hustlepreneurs deploy automation at massive scales to manage risk and overhead. The output of automated marketing content at scale accumulates into whole networks, whole social networks serviced almost entirely by bots and bot performing humans who in turn create new opportunities for market capitalization. And I don't know if you guys know anything about SEO, but the observable internet has been shrinking in comparison to a sea of literally illegible, buried, hidden SEO text that's crawled and logged by bots. The performance of sole proprietor enterprise explodes in volume, while full-time self-employment rates stay relatively static. Labor continues to fragment and convolve into, and again I say this, representation work. See also the MLM foot soldier, the average LinkedIn user, or the FinDom simp. So we're starting with the easy ones, but we're going down a little deeper. This is definitely still on the one of the easy ones. So this is Wojak. I think everybody knows Wojak. Wojak is the paradigm of reaction and meta reaction that has come to replace the occurrence of discrete events. So the end of Justin Bieber and Selena Gomez's relationship may have actually happened, but the event has been compiled into a discourse that continues to this day. So the threshold around events Paul stretch through discourse, through time, and appear at present as a flat stack. The Wojak is always one of many. Anthony Fantano is a Wojak, but he could only be a Wojak because of the numerous live reactions to Anthony Fantano, listening to Joey Badass, Kanye West, or The Caretaker. Wojaks themselves are fungible in terms of their position taking with respect to events. Eve Barlow appeared on the scene as a hashtag MeToo Wojak before becoming a Jeremy Corbyn Wojak and is now an Israel-Palestine Wojak. Or Hassan Piker presents as a socialist Wojak, but functionally reacts to anything or anyone. A Wojak is the translation of spectatorship into a productive mode. An event is observed, repackaged by the Wojak, and then appears as a consumable thing only upon its own repackaging by another Wojak. The stacks of Wojaks grow into unpredictable verticalities, often branching into consolidated discursive objects that trigger their own new Wojak stacks. So the Wojak operates like a SAS module, right? Wojaks exist insofar as they can manifest chains of small knots of value add and complexity. Wojaks, I love this guy so much. Wojaks are obsessed to each other, overwriting each other's content, speaking over each other in live reaction videos, iterating upon new efficiencies and the ability to deliver multiple strata of information simultaneously. A mature Wojak is a media network from the expanded PewDiePie universe to the Mr. Beast commercial empire. Advanced Wojaks impersonate and perform like software platforms. Wojaks host discourse, and in turn, they commercialize their hosted services like Patreon. They exhibit network effects, and often they engage in direct platform-to-platform partnerships like, Joe Rogan and Spotify. So through the intensification pathway of the Wojak, it follows a few intersecting trajectories. You have acronymology that enforces sedimented social and political identity combinatoriality, right? This grid that you are made up of, essentially. Then reaction and meta reaction spin out into a cottage industry. Extremely low overhead content production is a plus. Platforms develop to explicitly host this type of content with lower and lower overhead apart from SaaS fees. So, Patreon, Substack, Twitch, whatever. Then Wojaks create their own network effects and accumulate into cross-brand networks. Platforms compete for platform exclusivity. Everyone's a platform. So see also Stan Warrior, Bot Army Commander, or Cringe Community Consumer. That's consumer with 2 O's. All right, here we go.
Okay, well, let us now discuss zombie formalism. And, we are playing fast and loose with this term, but we're really interested in zombism. And the zombified art world is probably the only domain of the art world that is genuinely producing new work through its insane proliferation of new modes of media, of zombism. While the rest of us wallow away, iterating on the same old stuff, mixed media pastiche, play with an already saturated referential space, differing political posturing, technological animism, collapseology, discourse poaching from object-oriented ontology or media studies or critical theory. The zombie formalist is actually doing what Caroline Busta and the brilliant New Models crew identifies the future of art to be: a deprioritization of content production, which is now cheap and eminently available, in favor of direct engagement with media infrastructure. That is, the pipelines and plumbing systems through which content is both determined and delivered. While we fail our way through the tier 3 gallery world, or break off and focus entirely on critical media, principally about the unfairness or obsolescence of the art world, the zombie formalist is achieving Shopify mastery, actively facilitating the arbitrage of their work and repackaging what art used to be into levels of heretofore unimaginable financialization and abstraction. While we leer at the cringe marketplace, half-heartedly participating but with maximal self-distance in the direct exchange of dignity for social capital and revenue, the zombie formalist is flipping their canvases around on Instagram like a car wash sign spinner, posing with Jordan Peterson, leveraging their correct understanding of art making as a type of social performance instead of commodity production, and riding it all the way to collaborations with Target, Nike, Gucci, or the civic infrastructure of Qatar, Hong Kong, or Los Angeles, therein producing the kind of downstream cultural trend construction we used to attribute to an avant-garde. Art solidifies its status as an intentional relationship between algorithm, performance, and social infrastructure. The intensification pathway of the zombie formalist follows a few intersecting trajectories. First, post-commodity art world economies engenders a forcing function. Either work directly with futures investment as a medium, or build a post-commodity art world around the performance of being an artist as an experience one can buy and sell into. Aesthetics follows and flows downstream from volatility and from the reciprocal limitations computation imposes as it inscribes itself upon the social. On one hand, art as futures and art as future instrument goes through high volatility, boom and bust cycles, which in their inefficiencies spin off new microfinancial cottage industries and tech. On the other hand, artistry becomes a kind of overhead managed in non-traditional ways, subject to various algorithmic principles around engagement. Some break off into, like myself, a kind of Discord production about the art world, which spins off into yet another influencer economy. See also Crypto Bro, Saltpe, Steakhouse during Art Basel Goer, MFA Haver.
Okay, now we're starting to get a little darker. Here are three gameplay loops that reconsume the loss of individual scale or local scale agency within the whirlwind of higher scale complexity and overdetermination. So the first is the NEAT. I'm sure you guys know NEAT as not in education, employment, or training. I think it's a British term. So the NEAT is disengaged from the performativity of meat space, specifically to the theatricality of labor. The NEAT is a realist who rejects the aggregation and structuration of epistemological resources on visibly unsteady foundation. Word. The game world everts through itself. So to the NEAT's eyes, us daywalkers are the real NPCs, intractably bound to a fragile and pathetic theatrical production without firm basis, morbidly compelled to keep the show going. The NEAT doesn't claim access to a more stable real, but is an existentialist with a streak of dopamine utilitarianism. The NEAT is fully jacked into game world to the most visible detriment of physical health and social belonging, gooning until he dies. This appears outwardly as withdrawal, but is more likely a hard opt-in to the manifest intensity of game world at the expense of lower intensity corporeal attachments. Neat gameplay is often substantially less stratified or simultaneous than the other NPC variants. There's no interest in maintaining vast and complex social networks, especially those with downstream IRL manifestations, nor is there interest in maxing discourse and its various biotechnical impositions. Instead, the Neat just mainlines a few games during all waking hours, often becoming a kind of ambient environmental fixture, unbound to the apparent physics of a game through his mastery of their natural laws, either unleashing torment upon new users, like a kind of hyper enemy. I'm thinking of the South Park World of Warcraft episode, or a kind of benign mystical presence. It's precisely this single stream style of gameplay that keeps the Neat sharp enough to operate at this level. So the intensification pathway of the Neat follows these trajectories. So you have devcos that create in-game microeconomies, you have games as a service, loot crates, in-game microtransactions, and more importantly, recurring revenue DLCs in order to take gameplay from a single purchase commodity into subscription software as a service. Game developers measure replay value and time spent in-game as core metrics against revenue retention. Obvious. But as a result, and I don't think a lot of people talk about it this way, like game worlds became a lot larger and more immersive, right? Then we started to get our MMORPGs, our open worlds, and our roguelikes with less narrative gameplay. They actually start to become dynamic worlds because, I mean, you're expected to live in them, right? In parallel, and this is like a kind of cool reconsumptive thing, but that doubles down and creates the feedback loop. Like game players invent alternative modes of consuming high emergence single track games, from the high score to the speed run to the 0% speed run. Big shout outs 0% speed running, to the meme percent speed run to the damageless speed run. This is one of the most insane, most incredible pieces of art I've ever seen. So Wojak stacks then accumulate on top of this content, and various parallel complexity economies result. See also Hikikomori, Ant Triber, Robux Harvester. Darker and darker. The Fawn Core. The internet is daddy. Fawn Core is the fetish and outright sexualization of what the World Economic Forum calls total brain transparency, an attempt to assert agency through performative opt-in, or rather, not opt-out. Like the Neat, the fawn's mobility is delimited to the four square walls of a dimly lit bedroom. But the fawn is adept at context switching between meat space and game world, and in fact, it facilitates and sustains a portal through which the atmosphere between the two worlds is thinned. The fawn is a détournement and acceleration, of course, of Tikkun's young girl, right? But in this, now we're talking irony poisoned, benzo addicted as a bit, wine drunk, open to any and all consumption as long as it's easy. So unlike the Tikkun's young girl, the fawn is not an active consumer, but is rather an open vessel pending the direction of frictionless ad tech. And this reflects a change, a serious, like critical and important change in the modality of commodity consumption from active, actively buying commodities or products, to passive, receiving subscription services. The fawn just doesn't care enough to opt out and owns it. The fawn's relationship to agency is super complex. There's a kind of initial gesture to agency as the expression of its intentional release, followed with a kind of flavor of agency that irony bestows upon action. But everything contained within those mustache brackets is anagential, total openness and receptivity, free use. So the intensification pathway of the fawn follows a few intersecting trajectories. First, complexity becomes complicated by post-commodity markets. You have the fungibility of all goods, the proliferation of brand knockoffs, the oversaturation of content, conflation of conspicuous consumption with SpawnCon. All roads lead to a cliff for a consumer class who has historically constructed intricate identity assemblages around consumption patterns. And this is where, like, I think this gets really intense. Like, new digital marketplaces make consumption frictionless, which entwines discourses of consumption with the ethics of consent and the aesthetics of death and childlike vulnerability. Markets are quick to capture and commodify this orientation to an aesthetic of consumption. The reuptake machine goes burr, and this mode of being in the world is manufactured and sustained. In contradistinction, see the opposite of the fawn, the ahagao girl or e-girl, a substratum of the hustlepreneur whose overt cosplay of video game characters, embodied performance of specific patterns of transcribed virtual physicalities, in some cases the subordination of physical activity to third-party remote viewers, and dialect, race, and age play from digital media bears ostensible similarity to fawn core, but with strictly commercial priorities. Like the fawn is not attempting to profit from anything, and that's pretty cool. Darker yet, While the fawn fetishizes the affective agency received from opting into the game world, so long as it comes to the fawn, the being baby instead takes its satisfaction from powerlessness altogether. There's no pretense of an opt-in. It has already occurred, and it's a kind of giddy joy in the release of responsibility. The being baby consists in the representation of basic labor reproduction activities as significant milestones, creating and pantomiming cohorts of content around cleaning one's room, fixing one's car, doing table stakes financial planning, or, in more extreme cases, waking up and getting dressed, eating and drinking water. While it might not appear that the being baby is celebrating their execution of any of these activities, it is instead a celebration of their not having done these activities yet, because it's okay and valid, which it is, to struggle to brush your teeth or do your laundry from time to time. But what happens is that each of these activities are therefore filmed, shared, and reconsumed as exceptional moments, which shifts basic self-maintenance from meat space to the cloud. The being baby has an interesting relationship to prepubescence. And prepubescence in many ways itself can articulate a shift from externalized to internalized accountability. So the being baby adopts this aesthetic regime and colorways from children fashion. So, clown core, as I like to call it, my comfy couch core, or for the collection and self-surrounding of children's toys, stuffies and Funkos. Its sexualities range from the kind of imaginative sexual becoming that accompanies these surroundings, a very online, fantastical sexuality, less about the exchange of fluids and more about the performance of storybook fantasy roles, to the long delays or outright abstinence from sex altogether, the demi-romantic cuddles only pipeline. The intensification pathway of the being baby follows a few intersecting trajectories. Visible life events posting, you get engaged, you buy a house, you get pregnant, you have a birthday. It's afforded significant algorithmic priority on biographical games like Facebook or Instagram, in turn receiving outsized engagement and dopamine reward. But these milestones are often contingent upon financial liquidity, which is increasingly captured by cost of living inflation, lift, and labor precarity, and the burden of opt-out microtransactional economy. So, a complex sexual regime develops around both the widespread availability of pornography, especially parasocial, digitally mediated encounters, alongside a moral and political reckoning on the complexity of sexual mores. Young generations have, less and less sex. So, tying all this together, reconsumptive discourses, largely non-economic, mostly parapsychological or folk psychological discourses around life progression, develop, and proliferate, circulating more accessible life benchmarking and a kind of non-teleological state of arrested development. Self-recognition with accessible benchmark discourse leads to a non-teleological state. Oh, sorry. Self-recognition with accessible benchmark discourse leads to new network effects. Economies emerge first around the capture of nostalgia, but then quickly move to adults marketed children's media in general. See also self-carer, puppy girl, ABDL. Three final loops about swimming in noise, and then we'll do a brief conclusion. Yeah, bluesy adults, watch out. That's a very funny comment. So three more loops, and then we'll do a conclusion. So this is the exopreneur who dreams about starting over, generating a new Age of Empires map, or starting a new run of Gary's mod. So you've maybe seen some permutations of this where some people are potentially building an independent city-state on the Mediterranean coast, either for a substratum of phylogenetically optimized tech bro, or for the world's most looks-maxed gays. Or you also have certain stratum of tech bro starting colonies on Mars, right? So sovereignty has always been an obsession of the right, but now it faces the limiting factor of a fully territorialized Earth. Those that get closer to reality still remain mawkishly untethered from the real world. As a result, the exopreneur lives in Fantasyland, working with other like-minded individuals on Reddit or Discord to enumerate the rules and requirements of a fictional new politics. Some go so far as to actively LARP their fictional empires on Twitter or Discord, litanizing entire fictitious histories, territorial relationships, racial traits, social functions, archetypes, ruling hierarchies. And it seems like these weird worlds, often far right leaning, but occasionally, horseshoe theoried in from the other side, are some of the only places where actual political innovation occurs, principally because this activity consists of fantasy. The exopreneur, while reliant upon a community within which to house the physics of their chunk of some new world, is, almost always a solo enterprise, a tremendous irony about their politics. After all, the most superficial disagreements within some joint fiction, some fake new world you built together, could easily lead to break-off self-determination, right? It's easy to find new land in text-only virtual space. The intensification pathway of the exopreneur follows these intersecting trajectories. So, geopolitical arrangements become prefigured by an aggregation of sufficient history, resource location, and population growth. And significant events are determined at too high a scale for upstream impact, despite enormous downstream implications. Algorithmic governance, specifically around politics, contains certain forms of political speech within a super small limited set of hypernormative platforms. You have upvote, downvote mechanics alongside eyeball and engagement metrics, which engage in a feedback loop with respect to platform norms, obviously. But here's where kind of the new point is that the necessity of an open world for speculative politics, the pre-existing game templates for open worlds that we have, like turn-based strategy and speculative literary modes like fanfic, like that's what politics kind of meshes into together. It compresses political innovation into a narrow and obscure expressive vehicle. See also r/poll, Groyper, Jobbik. The Dream Reader. The Dream Reader is a prestige class apopheniac. They apply Kabbalistic hermeneutics to noise. Like an LLM themselves, the Dream Reader imbibes terabytes of random information and outputs arcane organizing structures. They then process their newfound wisdom through some re-encoding function that redisguises these knowledges as poetry. But for the Dream Reader, everything is poetry. Everything is poetic text that's assembled and deployed by some universalized author function for them alone to understand. The Dream Reader is the most outwardly schizophrenic of the NPCs. Given the complexity of their hermeneutical operations, they tend to adopt idiolectic manners of speech. While they may at first aggregate a cult-like audience, the complexity of their message produces just too much friction to sustain a following, and they recede into passive gossip stones. Encountering an advanced Dream Reader in meat space is unsettling. They are clearly living in an inaccessible alternative reality, which in its viscous constitutedness troubles the reality of the encounterer. Dream readers are archons of confusion. If you spend too much time in the proximity of a dream reader, you can lose yourself. Because internet monoculture is so committed to such a hardcore, aggressive performance of its own wholesale realness, a bit of confusion here or there can place you on an alternative epistemological plane altogether. Fake news. The intensification pathway of the Dream Reader follows, these intersecting trajectories. So you have success in hypervolatile marketplaces hinges upon the ability to read the future in noise. Like that's a value now. And masking investment strategies requires further noise generation. Bot-generated noise interacts with various social reuptake mechanisms, which inscribes noise with the patterning of hidden meaning. Ambient schizophrenic tendencies pair strongly with resurgent psychedelic culture. Discursive density, e.g. lore, accumulates to Borgesian levels where communication becomes impossible across different discursive clusters. See also MLM, S-Corp CEO, Gen Alpha, Ayahuasca Shaman, gang stalking victim. I need a little coffee. All right, last loop is the overdoser who takes it all in. They're every thought fragment hungry for the potential to be a direct through line to hyper chaos. Lots of Nickland memes. The overdoser iterates through a maximalist aesthetic that synthesizes hentai, happy hardcore, CCP propaganda. Here, a use of the term transsexuality specifically invoked over the concept of the transgender. Oakley's, Monster Energy, M90, maxi dresses, crypto, ketamine, AR-15s, shimmer ontology, angelic materialism, ironic test realism. You can add anything to this list, by the way, and it fits. Dolphins, Deer Hunter, The Smiths, Ocean Waves. It's all just about velocity, combinatoriality, aesthetic intention, suicide, and head rush. What I love about the overdoser is that they love voiceovers. There's always this kind of pastiche of insane internet content, just like this is, with the voiceover over it. The voiceover provides a thread of narrative contiguity that allows the hyper aesthetic undercurrent to take all the jump cuts it needs. Unlike the cryptic, unintelligible speech of the Dream Reader, the overdoser's voiceover is also unintelligible, but it's about the affective grain of the voice, the acousmetra, the anonymity of the speaker who just gapes in ecstatic awe at the flood of garbage information, encouraging you to find something beautiful and compelling simply about volume. The overdoser is inspired by the last few lines before the end credits start to roll. They're convinced that the world is about to end, and they're obsessed with collapsology discourse and singularity worship. They are kind of light worker accelerationists in that they recognize that they have the power somewhat to hyperstition singularity into existence, but not through technological means, but simply through a kind of mass information processing brain death, jamming more crap into an Alzheimerizing model of a model of a model, and recursively re-injecting whatever crap comes back out. The intensification pathway of the overdoser follows a few intersecting trajectories. Referential space becomes completely saturated due to raw quantity of content. Various human expressive drives remain unsatisfied by the avenues available to content production or identity combinatorics. And the one kind of alternative becomes quickly identified as a kind of catch-all for aestheticized meta consumption, which is swimming in the affect of raw volume. And what's kind of interesting is that like all that stuff kind of looks the same. And then meta consumption stacks accumulate over each other, and meta referential spaces become more and more saturated. And with saturation comes contingency, comes the accumulation of DAOs and revenue circulation. See also discourse addict, Russian ironic Nazi DAO operator. Okay, we made it to the conclusion, Roberto. Not bad, not bad, not bad. We're on time here. Good. So we have a kind of a short concluding segment that consists of positions basically. Like there's been an attempt to stay descriptive here and staying in the moment a little bit while identifying some feedback loops and some opportunities for intensification. But in tying things up, we want to identify some of the implicit commitments we've made that could feel like position taking. So a few things of note. First on exocapitalism. I agree with Suhail Malik. Like there is an incorrect emphasis assigned to labor within left accelerationism. It seems like exocapitalism will get weirder and weirder, possibly generating entire virtual sandbox economies, maybe interdimensional trade between speculative virtual environments, modes of exchange that are incomprehensible to us. I can imagine quantum computing will feel especially promising in this regard. It seems possible that our ability to convincingly affect drag will collapse. And perhaps there'll be some forcing function to rehabilitate that space formerly held by white collar labor, but it seems more likely that this will be a protracted drop off and that things will get substantially weirder before the floor caves and precarity becomes truly universal. The position taking with respect to capitalism, however, should be interpreted as ambivalent. I'm not into capitalism being a kind of bogeyman. It would probably be better for us to spend more time interrogating the proto-capitalist feudal and slave systems that we rely on to function. But it is possible that these awful conditions flow downstream from a scaling problem and not from capitalism as a determinative final boss. And like, here's where I like kind of pause. I'm just like, I don't know what to do with this, but it does seem that scaling problems seem like a super real and difficult solution for us to handle. There's just too many people with too much history, with too many resources in too specific locations, and there's too little time. And we don't have any suggestions here apart from pointing at them and wojacking. We'd love to see a pragmatics of scaling problems and of scale, generally speaking.
Now, on the game world, we do have the sense that the flatness of game world is bound to the present state of computation, both as a field of inquiry and as a series of bottlenecks. The position of artificial intelligence research seems somewhat connected to game world, at least in the prescriptive quality of its use cases, user bases, and in turn the constituency of its data sets. It seems that most foundational models have been subject to at least some constraints from game world, however significant. Now, generative AI tools delivered via LLMs and transformers, tools that retain, we believe, unfortunate connections to the social, have accelerated the feedback loops in game world, probably significantly. This could mean that the most non-theoretical research in deep learning would not reduce the flatness of game world. Maybe this is not the right position for investment. Further, the coupling between computation and social feedback seems good. It is possible to read in this an ambivalence to the possibilities the art world may possess with respect to its ability to influence the emerging global monoculture away from game world. It is every bit as likely to be an accelerant and a decelerant. Now, on the human, the position taken with respect to the NPC should be read as sympathetic. The position taken with respect to the concept of creativity should be read as ambivalent. It does seem like, regardless of what this particular dispositive actually means, its applications serve as more of a propellant to the world flattening rasterization problem than anything else. We can identify two paths here. You can try to rehab the Enlightenment subject, but its material basis seems fully eroded. Or perhaps you can lean into the emerging monoculture, and with it the fractalization of the individual, so long as our computational infrastructure can support it with more vigorous realism as a direct path toward new ontological anarchies. The position taken with respect to human or anthropogenic agency should be read as a position on a scaling problem. It seems likely that a lot of impactful things happen at scales that we do not have access to as individuals or as social bodies, and that our inability to create scalable decision making likely blocks the ability to affect anything but the most modest direct upstream impact. And with that, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We can now move to questions and answers. If you have a question, raise your hand and please turn on your camera as well.
So I hope that you have some questions. If anything, we have to apologize about the amount of content that we've managed to compress into the presentation. But yeah, we tried to, present something that was.
I see something from Daniel de la Torre.
Yeah. What NPC are you?
Whoa.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry if I'm bored you. I have a very rancid approach, Lukácsian approach, which is of course rancid as I expect you to think. But my question is that how can we think about the building of the material infrastructure that is needed for powering a digital network? I'm thinking of mining and the extraction of natural resources is not extractivism and mining like they did to maintain the whole digital world, and how can the impersonality of capital be maintained when always dependent decision making at last minute decision making? So that are my two questions.
I think maybe just with respect to the first of the questions, like I had a couple slides there with cobalt mines and lithium mines, for example, and like it's absolutely true. Of course, computation is one, and the entire financial economy is totally contingent in some way that is a little bit difficult to account for. And I would probably say like we should probe on that necessity to a certain extent, though I'm not sure that I'm the person that's qualified to do that. But here's where I'd argue that like those necessary material operations are largely being excised through commercial forces and social control mechanisms that are outside of what we strictly refer to as a kind of capitalist modality, right? Like those occur in very specific places with specific geopolitical considerations that underlie it, right? So there's a problem there that capitalism is very happy, or exocapitalism is very happy to exploit because it doesn't want to touch those things. Does that make sense as an answer, or I'm not quite sure? Are you asking for an alternative? I think you're
It is
still.
all right. It is all right. It's too much information, and I have to rewatch the whole thing. Thank you.
Okay. Hey Reza, I'm nervous when you raise your hand. What's up?
Well, I cannot thank you enough for this magnificent, utterly magnificent presentation. Absolutely. Philosophically understood, there is a difference between those who, always try to pigeonhole problems. And this pigeonholing of a problem is absolutely fine philosophically, right? To accurately analyze a certain sort of thing. But there is a certain sort of other sort of philosophical courage to broaden the scope of a certain sort of problem so vastly and so complexly that you say to yourself, what the fucking God? And I think that what you did was something akin to that, right? I don't know exactly what my question would be at this point, because, it is kind of like, it's like I thought that I wrote Cyclopedia and I was a good writer, but now I'm becoming jealous that why didn't I actually talk about the Ludo Digitalpedia, complicity with anonymous materials, right? And I think that you delivered something akin to that, fundamentally magnificent. So I don't know exactly what my question would be, but I'm just trying to think about it with you. So if I'm not mistaken, you have fundamentally found a certain sort of binder, crazy glue, historical crazy glue, that is going to be defining moment for the culture, historical moments, politics, economy, whatever shit that we are going to talk about from this point onward. And that's crazy glue is the gamification of the entire history, right? Then we might ask ourselves that what exactly led to this moment from a historical perspective? I mean, this is a bizarre sort of event, right? The complicity of everything being revealed in a certain sort of gamification that now is becoming more and more explicit to us humans, right? What exactly did it happen in history to bring us at the brink of such a thing?
Roberto, you have any idea?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, Roberto might actually tell us something.
Yeah, I mean it's an unbelievably difficult question because it seems like it's one of those moments where what's that Mandela effect, if you know what I mean? It seems almost like we've kind of collectively stepped into across some kind of threshold, and there's a tremendous forgetting that happened on the other side of that threshold,
Yeah.
Right.
I think there's a combination of elements that had different implications at different historical moments, and we were unaware of the how these elements were actually combining into something a bit more complicated than each element taken separately, let's put it that way. And I think at different historical moments, these elements were introduced as answers to a problem or as ways to move things forward. And now they're trying to take this kind of constellation configuration and they're acquiring, in a way, I guess, a new meaning. So yeah, I mean, that's probably my feeling on how that came to be.
Fundamentally, completely unrelated to what you two have been talking about. I mean, this is just like something purely out of personal intrigue that I'm asking. So there is this gamification, and we should somehow accept that it is there. You cannot undo it at this point. Literally, this is a historical process. And the more within the gamified setting people are understanding the meaning of history, the more dangerous it can get, literally. Is there going to be a leadership in this? Or is it just going to be goddamn chaotic game forum, people talking past each other?
If anything, it's getting more kind of fractionalized in that specific way. I mean, what leadership means, it's funny just thinking about like kind of corporate language and that specific kind of word, leadership is like it's changed from a kind of like romantic Napoleonic figure or something like that with a small sword, you know what I mean? And now leadership is something that's kind of it's like an energy that is characteristic to a Discord forum or something like that. Like
Right.
it's not owned by a person.
The
And what's funny
Discord
is
Napoleon, the
yeah,
Discord Napoleons
yeah.
of world unite.
I mean, I think that's candidly, Reza, I think that's our only hope is the Discord Napoleons of the world unite. Because I mean, yeah, it's that is one of those spaces where we do think that like political imagination is thriving, albeit in like a pretty reprehensible and kind of execrable way. But what's interesting about Discord is that like increasingly that's not a place that you go where your identity is represented at all, right? You have like 6 different personas that travel across 75 different discourse clusters and like Discord clusters, and like each you're a little part of yourself is manifested and kind of torqued in each of those relationships. And
How much do
yeah,
you
I don't
think
know.
that it is actually the realization of Curtis Yarvin's digital feudalism? In a weird way,
Yeah.
orbit.
I mean, we've been dancing around that, right? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
There's a big question that remains kind of unanswered, I think, in what we presented, or answered to some extent, or there's a hint at an answer, which is there's that idea of kind of lateral agentic move, and how that might come to be, which is to us maybe too early to attempt to articulate, and maybe it's a question that doesn't need to be answered, because as soon as you answer that kind of question, then it becomes a different type of problem.
Right.
So yeah, that's
Superb. Thank you so much.
Wait, just first, because Diana said something about moderators, I feel like I had a very good, yeah, I really like this slide here. This is what I think moderation is right now in this particular space. Like volunteer Reddit moderators who do not have mod powers, but their reports are taken seriously, and those who get on my bad side tend to get banned in under 24 hours, right? Like it's this kind of anonymous kind of tentacle of the organism moderating itself as a kind of self-deputized sheriff or something like that. And actual Discord moderators, tend to be kind of different variations of this kind of mentality. Okay, we have a lot of questions.
Yeah, there's some questions in the
Yeah.
chat. I don't know if Shyama
Yeah.
or Devin or
we
if
can take them.
Leslie, if you'd like to speak, and if not, the questions in the chat can be read aloud so that they're recorded. I'll start with Shyama. If you would like to ask the question yourself, you may.
Yeah, it's just like I think it's a lot. Like, how did you manage to do this without getting lost and overwhelmed? Because anything I do, that's what happens to me. So yeah.
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So we've been discussing a lot of these ideas for a while, and then there's something happening in Marek's brain that is beyond my ability to comprehend things. And one day he just put together this incredible collection of ideas into a kind of mind map, and that's kind of the core starting point of everything that I think happens today. We've been just refining that. So I guess it's a process. We've been working together for years. There has been a lot of dialogue. We have explored different ideas together. We have dropped some of them, and this is something that has been kind of sedimenting for a while. And Marek is actually amazing at finding these kind of connections and creating these kind of universes. So yeah, kudos to him.
Obviously, that feeling is very
Devin,
mutual.
if you'd like to speak. If not, I can read this question. I'll give a moment. The question reads, what do you see as the origin of game world? Have we always been gamified? Has there been an intensification of gamification? Or do you see gamification as a novel phenomenon? And what use might identifying the origin of the game world be to perhaps de-sediment these causal loops?
I mean, that does kind of move back to Reza's question a little bit, and I think it's a really important question. But I really don't have the answer. I mean, you could point to Taylorism, right? Like that's a really kind of classical example of like a kind of origination of kind of game mechanics. And I'm sure, obviously all the, I don't want to say all of social history, but there's always been an element of performance and gamed interaction between individuals. But yeah, I just don't think that there is. I mean, I know for a fact that there's never been such a vertiginous kind of multi-scalar kind of gameplay prior to this moment. That's what I'm kind of interested in, is less the kind of moment by moment non-digitally mediated gameplay and more this like I am playing so many, like I'm like watching my intermittent fast counter countdown as I'm having this conversation. Like I am completely subsumed and subordinated to game logics. I don't know if finding that moment that the curtain kind of came over will help us, because I think it'll kind of continue to point us away from the game. It'll continue to point us to like an escape or some kind of possibility of an alternative. And I'm much more, as you could tell from the talk, like I'm much more interested in an intensification of the game world, so much that so long as there exists some computational capacity to sustain the game world in a realistic way.
Yeah, and I think there's an element there. Maybe I'm going too far here. I mean, the game world has always been there. I would say it's part of human nature, but the problem with that we might have now is that the game world has no outside, and that might be kind of a new historical situation, and that's something that I think we need to analyze. And yeah, there's a lot to kind of unravel there. Yeah.
Okay, we can move to the raised hands, I think. Cosmos.
Yes. Hi, Roberto, Marek. Great presentation. Really like your material and how you connect all these things together. So I have, I think, a comment, mostly to what Reza told before, and the question. So the comment is about what conditions brought to this gamification process. And my observation is that, for example, the military or the academia is already heavily gamified through millennia. So all these things with ranks and hierarchy and follow the rules and you will get up on the hierarchy. This exists and has reshaped the whole modernity and Western culture and what is currently dominates the capitalist system. My question is there an NPC version for the aspiring theoretician philosopher who play the game of academia, play the game of publishing, plays the more current game of going to YouTube channels or make debates with Jordan Peterson or something like that? Is there an NPC character for that?
That's the Wojak. Definitely, that's the Wojak. Right? The Wojak is this kind of like reciprocal discursive object where the talking head, as we are all here, talking head kind of accumulates on top of a talking head, accumulates. And yeah, I mean, discourse is an amazing game with an amazingly interesting microeconomy.
Thank you.
Okay, MDM. If you'd like to ask your question.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So yeah, thank you for that. That was amazing. Definitely maximal. I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this one again. But just as like a corollary, I guess, Ketostero's Spam of the Earth. She talks about the constant exposure from data colonies and how this is problematic for truth because it kind of treats it as like a associative similitude rather than anything that's like rigorous or like mathematical. And like the epitome of this is like the Sesame model, which is basically just like it's like who is what's currency. So I guess like toward the end of that talk, she says, as like maybe like a response to what we're talking about with like the gamification, and there's no outside to the gamification. She offers this idea of just like locking up aesthetics into like the museum. It's like a symbol. I mean, she realizes it's going to leak out, but also just as like a practice, it might be able to to limit things like, you know, one of the big reasons why the 2008 financial con happened was because these mathematical models that were being presented were just aestheticized. Like the models looked very, very amazing and very sexy. And so I'm just wondering what you think of her idea of, you know, locking up all the art pieces at the museum, so to speak.
Better than locking them up in shipping containers, I suppose, right? That at least would be a good start. Maybe Roberto, do you mind if I go first, and then I'll pass the mic to you? Yeah, I love that piece. First, like just a comment on like the spam component. There's a later on in Duty Free Art, there's a quote from her that I really love, where she talks about the author function of spam, and I'm just going to quote her as a performative chaos in which actors, consumers, and spam and service workers become indistinguishable. The linear and teleological progression of history is discontinued. People are being included into the world of spam and turned into potentially edible matter. I love that. I think that's a really nice quote from her. And if I recall correctly, in that spam interview, there's a video piece of hers, which is essentially about like constructing kind of different ways of hiding from digital capture, like kind of blurring the face in different ways, or, you know, stepping outside of the camera, very cheekily done. I really love the way that video has started to look like, you know, now I can imagine it looking like a performance art piece, maybe in kind of like mid to late post-internet art sort of era. Like I could definitely see that being reconsumed there. And now I can totally imagine, probably we could find, you know, 20,000 YouTube videos with a kind of very similar aesthetic and like preaching the same method. Like, yeah, I mean, things spill out in precisely that way, and it's really difficult to control them. The only other comment that I have is about museums, which is like, sure, we've all watched like what's happening to museums now, which is that museums are becoming experiences, and they're like, I mean, they're subordinated to the logics of event marketing like everybody else is. So a museum is a thing that you take a selfie in, and like all the kind of ambient dynamics have to be constructed around selfieable kind of content. Obviously, the famous one here is the ice cream museum, right? So yeah, I mean, the museum doesn't seem like it's the inviolable location that it used to be. I know that I forget exactly where it is, the something house in the UK is having that kind of exhibition on Cute going on right now, which everyone's talking about, which looks really cool. That kind of juxtaposes Hello Kitty with a number of kind of more interesting contemporary digital artists, and that kind of juxtaposition maybe allows for a little bit of like a locked up space being, you know, counterposed in a more kind of selfie friendly dynamic. But yeah, I mean, I just don't, I think Roberto had me kind of tone down my antipathy towards art in this presentation a little bit. Like, I just don't think, I don't think locking anything down is going to help anybody, nor do I think releasing it is going to help anybody. I think it's already done.
Yeah, no, I agree with Mark there. I think, Mark, you're an artist, but you wish you weren't, which is, it's a hard thing to be.
I'll never forget when I first met Reza, who's definitely like an incredible influence on my life historically. Like Roberto and I read all of his books, and when we first met each other, we introduced ourselves as artists, and he said, "Oh, you guys are still practitioners," and that stuck with me.
Gavin, would you like to speak?
Sure. Thank you, Roberto and Marek, for this. And Roberto, thank you for staying with us in your time zone. My question, well, first I'll start with the comment, which is the information density of the presentation was amazing. It reminded me of watching something like Benjamin Bratton's The Stack, but unsterilized, whereas you delve into this really kind of underbelly of the internet where The Stack, I don't think, really gets to that. I'm curious if that was an influential work to you, and follow up with the mentioning of Hitos Sterile. Have you considered making this into a video essay?
Answer to the second question is, I think we did actually, back in Shenzhen, when you remember Li Shenhua came to visit, and he told us, you guys should be translating some of this into a kind of video format, but it never happened. And just to Bratton and to the stack, he's been, I think, really influential on the way we've approached some of the ideas. I think we have this podcast. We just released an interview with him last week. Was it last week, Marek?
Yeah. Just over a week and a half ago. Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to see that. Thanks for letting me know. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The podcast is called Disintegrator. Listen to it. His interview with us is pretty dark. It's really good.
We can share the link. And that was also interesting because we were discussing, what I think he calls now the hemispherical stacks and the role of China, AI in China, the idea that there's this book coming out now with MIT Press where he's working with Bognia Conyer and some of the people of NYU, Shanghai, and it's taken a really interesting turn that I think it's also kind of influential on the way we've been looking at things. And I think maybe Marek can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm like I'm most attracted to. I mean, The Stack is like an amazing book. I think it's like incredibly huge, and I like definitely am inspired by like the staggering intensity of it. Revenge of the Real is a book that I really like. Not maybe super aligned with it, but there's a kind of anti-humanism game that he's willing to play that I think a lot of people aren't, which I find very attractive. Not too attractive. I'm still here, but I always find it sexy when people are willing to kind of go a little bit farther than most of the others in the room.
Yeah, thank you all again so much. This was great.
Thank.
In the chats, there's some comments by Leslie, including a question if you'd like to speak. If not, I'll read the question.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I was thinking a lot
Thank you.
about futurism, specifically Lawrence Leck's video about it. And since we were talking like 2 seconds ago about China. And yeah, this idea, right, of the nation as an anonymous sort of production of I guess IP and technology. I'm curious if you've come across that theory, how you feel about it. Definitely still absorbing a lot of the info just now though.
Roberto, would you agree that like our trip to China? I mean, Roberto lives in Hong Kong, but we had a mutual trip to China together a couple months ago, and that was like an absolute mind fuck in terms of thinking about different hemispherical stacks as we were just discussing. Like it's really awesome to go to a place that has not a lack of game interfaces, right? Like a even more integration of game interfaces, but a different one. And that's a really interesting experience. Being unable to access old games that I was playing and accessing an entirely new suite of games with a totally, a completely unintelligible game interface to me. I found that to be really, really exciting. But maybe, Roberto, do you want to speak a little bit about Sino-futurism?
Yeah. I mean that's something that being in Hong Kong, that's part of my kind of reality here. We have people like Yuk Hui, who you might know, teaching here at CTU. He's also working in Europe a lot, and he's quite influential. And there's a whole scene now that is looking at China and what's going on there from different critical perspectives. I mean, as Marek was pointing out earlier, I had to kind of I had already realized what that kind of parallel stack system meant to some extent, and the complexity that entails the fact that although we think of the cloud as a kind of neutral, all connecting kind of hyper object, that's not the case. Yeah, it has these boundaries, and the idea that you can move between different stacks, I think, is quite interesting because some of the, I think, downstream kind of effects of some of the ideas we discussed today may differ depending on where on the world you actually stand, and there may be slightly different nuances and complexities to how to analyze that. So for both Mark and myself, when we were working in China, that was a really interesting kind of practice-based discovery, working with that parallel stack. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I definitely need to get into the stack discourse much more. Thanks.
Reza?
Rosa, you're muted, my friend.
You're muted.
My apologies. No, I think that if Keith is here, maybe he should ask as a collaborator with you a question. But I wanted to say something very specific. I heard, certain sort of comments. I think that, yes, I mean, gamification has been going on for millennials, right? Except that when we say gamification, it is not merely always, because we merely understand the idea of collectivity as its horizontality, and it is really not. There is a diagonal line between the vertical ascent of historicity and horizontal one, between the termites of history and between a leader, a messiah. And there is a diagonal line that is ultimately is history, right? And we see, if we go across the diagonal line of this ascent of gamification of history, given to us by religion, by monotheism, by whatever thing that we might think, mythology and rise of democracy, fascism, and so on and so forth, that there is always, as you have tried to capture, a certain sort of diagonal complicity here between the vertical forces and the horizontal forces. And we see that if we actually start to recognize a diagonal vector here that weaves through the horizontal and the vertical one, we see that there is an increase in the cunning of history, like literally plotting. Like, you see, and one of the greatest thing about gamification as an event, in our history right now, precisely because now we are somehow, in a Carnapian sense, in a computational sense, start to explicate and understand the cunnings of history, right? They might be pseudo-incomputable problems, but nevertheless, we now understand that, look, there are certain sort of things that we never actually understood about the cunnings of history, about plotting, about leadership. I mean, Dune Part 2 is a great example of that, right?
But doesn't that start to happen at kind of ironically precisely the moment as we start to achieve certain levels of scale that kind of allow us to both
the scale and the techniques to respond to those scales?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that creates this awful feeling, right? I mean, that's where all of this is contained. Yeah. Should we talk about the left? Is that I saw Jordan asked a question about the left. I don't know. Jordan,
Yeah,
I would love
to speak that question aloud, Jay.
I can't see it.
Can you elaborate a bit on moving away from centering labor analysis? Hasn't the labor relation always been somewhat gamified anyways? What conceptual replacements do we have on the left, or generally?
Hasn't the labor relation always been somewhat gamified anyways? Yes, though here's where I kind of point back to what we were essentially just talking about, where there is a kind of there's a kind of scale shift, and there is also kind of like a agential shift here that kind of like I would argue kind of raises this specific moment as kind of unique in some way. But I think the problem that I'm trying to articulate is that we spend a lot of time kind of still in 2023 kind of marinating in like what remains a very Marxian classical understanding of first of all what a commodity is, what alienation is, what these relationships are between capital and humans, and most importantly, we spend a lot of time specifically marinating in the revolutionary capacity of the working class. And I think the argument that we're trying to make is that the working class is being removed from capitalism. entirely if it isn't already removed from capitalism, and that creates some problems for its revolutionary capacity. So yeah, I think that would be my answer there. In terms of what conceptual replacements do we have on the left or for the left, I'm unsure if that's a question about conceptual replacements for labor, in which case I think I've offered what those are, which is like this kind of like exigent performative thing that like remaining white collar labor and some working class labor is doing. But if it's a conceptual replacement for the left, I think here's where I feel broadly sympathetic to a kind of like left accelerationism, but like Suhail Malik, I would love to see that kind of completely excised of the kind of like labor dynamics that have propelled it in the past. I don't know, Roberto, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the right answer. It's a bit late here, and my brain is melting a little bit. But I was thinking that I guess the point is trying to identify the extent to which the discussion of labor is relevant, and when that becomes not relevant anymore because of the mechanics of the system that we're actually dealing with. So it's not, and I wouldn't see it as speaking against labor as a concept and as a valid historical approximation, but there's a point where it becomes you cannot move within that framework anymore. So as far as you look at the human sphere at a kind of immediate level, that's an idea you might want to use. But then when you try to go beyond that, it becomes problematic. So yes, I think that's probably the answer I would give.
MDM, if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, just so about labor, I mean, it makes it difficult because all the social objects are, at least the digital ones, are somewhere in the platform among Meta or Amazon or Netflix or Google. Again, Hito has this like haunting metaphor where she says that Mang, Meta, Netflix, Google pretty much own all of our Dorian Gray paintings. So like basically, they know us better than we know ourselves. I mean, they have every tweet, every email. So, and this is haunting, especially in the Fisher sense, in the sense that it's like it's a failed morning, because how could you ever give up the ghost when everything's encrypted within the databases of Mang? And as far as labor goes, I mean, this is if all of the social objects that you've created, if it's behind databases and it's locked and sealed away, I mean, you don't have, I mean, what does that say about sort of like the ability to negotiate or things like this?
Yeah, exactly. The only kind of like fine point that I'd love to put on that is that I think Hito and a lot of people, I think like actually most people, as I was kind of talking about at the beginning of the talk, we love to look at Mang and say, Mang is like this collection of evil geniuses who are kind of prefiguring society to work in a specific way, and they want everybody to be oppressed and to be disciplined in this precise sort of manner, and they're instituting a kind of super complex control society. And I think that the stipulation that I want to make is that actually these organizations are super random and bilious, and like just, I mean, if you look at their internal constitution, it's insane. Like there's so much being contained with it. So there's this idea of a world owning the world. So yes, Fang or Mang or whatever might own all of our data, but if you look at think about the COVID pandemic in the West and how much of our data was like theoretically available to be leveraged for tracking purposes, nothing happened, right? Like there's no ability to operate on top of that data, and that might change, but I'm also not sure what would motivate that change, and I'm also not sure that we have the infrastructural means to construct that change within this kind of like bilious network of various third-party applets that are all kind of sutured together by Zendesk accounts. Like that just doesn't seem right to me. So yeah, I'm like, as you can probably tell, like I'm always skeptical of like the big bad wolf being out there. And instead it's much more of a kind of like opt-in, opt-out dynamic that's a little bit more complicated than that.
I think it's even worse too, because I don't think the pictures are being stored themselves. I mean, it's schizophrenized. I mean, they probably all have segments of the picture, right? And then there's a
Exactly, yeah.
palimpsest. It's palimpsested. So you have it just overlays, because I mean, obviously they're sharing data between the different platforms. I mean, it's not just one single monolith. So it just it complexifies the issue even more. But yeah, thank you.
And to Roberto's point, like the only thing that this leaves behind is the downscaling. Like that's the most important part. It's just like constant downscaling all the time that gets resynthesized through reuptake and then downscale, then downscale, and downscale.
Cosmos, before you ask your question, there's a question in the chat from Jose. I don't know if you have ability to speak now. I will read it aloud. What are some current alternative practices that could sustain participation in the game world, but which promote solidarity with human labor?
I think that would be the total liquidation of ourselves as individuals. I think that's like the only way to do that. I don't know what you think, Roberto.
Yeah.
Reza just unmuted.
Go on, Roberto, tell us.
To be honest, I mean, I think, I mean, our perspective, what Marek said to me makes sense. I'm sure that maybe, you know, some others have explored those alternatives and are trying to approach, I think, the problem that we have been trying to frame from a different perspective. But we feel, I guess, that way. There is a kind of rite of extinction that is happening. That is a, you know, cosmic contingency, if you want. Not a calamity, but just something that has to happen. We kind of frame this within this broader approach. And I guess that, you know, at least so far, the analytical perspective that we've taken probably doesn't have an answer to that question, if I have to be honest. Not that it doesn't exist, but not something we've considered, I think.
Are you sure you haven't considered it? At least you haven't seen the figure of the pure leader yet. You know, the view from nowhere and nowhere. You know, and manifestation of it, the horse, the zeitgeist on a horseback, a new Napoleon, so to speak.
I think we're all kind of, you know, being centrifuged together, and it's very possible that like new and kind of uncanny solidarities can develop on the inside of the blender. That sounds kind of more interesting to me. Yeah.
Right. I mean, but there should be a certain sort of precondition for this collective, I would say, not emotional, but political empathy to emerge in human society, right? And I would say that one of these preconditions would be essentially reimagining exactly what you have been talking about, a kind of a view from nowhere agency, right? And I remember explicitly 2004, Dr. Ray Brusier introduces the figure of such a thing. It is the marriage between Mao Zedong and Thomas Metzinger. Collectivity with no one.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's essentially what we're trying to talk about. But with that comes like something has to happen to agency and the kind of grasping that we keep on it. And like right now, I think that is something that we do find kind of beautifully in the internet is like all kinds of weird alternative modalities to agency that are developing that involve a kind of wholesale relinquishing of agency while still having some kind of, I don't know, uncanny lateral capacities, I guess. Like that's kind of interesting to me. But yeah, no, I'm a blender head, I think.
Cosmos, can you speak now?
Yeah, actually, my question is a bit related. So as exocapitalism, as the coding machine is unleashing new flows, reconfiguring the flows of desire, you can say in a very abstract general term. Do you see any form of subjectivity that you can really affirm? Because I have the impression all of these NPC characters you portray your position was quite critical and like a mockery in a way, and you're making fun of it. Is there any, or I mean, at least speculative or imaginary form of subjectivity that you can affirm and say, yeah, I want to be like that in the future?
I think, like, for me, there's a bit of jealousy when describing all of these figures, because they're able to kind of function in a way that I am not. And they've kind of found ways to kind of interject poetry back into experience in, some kind of unusual ways. But I don't know. I think probably the answer to your question is sort of no. I don't know, Roberto, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we kind of discuss a little bit in the book, no?
Yeah.
First chapter of the.
There's a kind of love of, there's in the book, there's like so we have a book with a contribution from Reza and a contribution with Keith. We should post the link in the chat. And in the first chapter, we kind of talk about sleepiness, and a kind of like a little bit of an affirmation of sleepiness, basically. We also extensively talk about, oh hell yeah, Cosmos, that's what is up. Oh man, that's awesome. I love to see it. I mean, the rest of the other kind of component of that chapter goes through a pretty extensive history of how the kind of demolition job that postmodernity did to subjectivity in general. And like, I don't know, it feels I think we were chatting about this with Ben Bratton on the podcast, like we need another word or something. Like there's a little bit of like legacy technology here. I think it would be really, really difficult to re-architect the Enlightenment subject on anything at this moment.
Yeah, I think that's work in progress. That's something we've discussed, but it's still to be defined. My guess that's something that it's gonna morph through time as we engage in new projects and discuss ideas from different perspectives and stuff. Yeah.
Just thinking about time, Roberto, like what is it, like 3:30 a.m. now?
It's tomorrow already.
Yeah, can we maybe like limit to a final
No,
question?
I'm fine. I'm jet lagged. I had like 2 liters of coffee.
No, this has been a while. Let's take one more and then come on, you should go to bed.
I see that there are several questions in the chat. If anyone
There's a magnificent
speak.
question there, More. Diana Rodriguez.
Diana,
Hey,
can you speak? Otherwise, I can read. There are 2 comments, or at least 2. There's one that
I can speak. It's just there is so much information that is really hard to compartmentalize. Like, so as soon as we talk about labor, I thought I thought about this example with Roblox and this whole thing with child labor, and I'm wondering if it's just a transfer of, like, labor is not only physical, but now it's digital too. I mean, it's obvious, but it's how are these kids being exploited? So I'm wondering how, and is something that you have considered.
There was I forget exactly where this took place, but there was a crazy cottage industry somewhere in, I think it was Malaysia, where there was like a specific game. It was literally just a game that was kind of like what's the game where you're kind of dragging the fruit around? Very famous kind of game, you know what I mean? To like make kind of 4 things click together and they disappear. Most famous.
Candy Crush.
Candy Crush. Yeah, there was a Candy Crush like
There you
game
go.
that had, thank you. That had like a kind of like for whatever reason, there was like a microtransaction that was connected to it, which developed into an entire economy that lasted for like 3 weeks and involved like tens of thousands of people playing this game full time and transacting off of it. Totally true. I think the argument here is that like when it comes to an environment like Roblox, first of all, is exactly like what I think is interesting about the contemporary video game world, in that it is designed to be a game as a service. It's like, and it's designed to be a world as opposed to designed to be a kind of narrative that you go through, right? And there's all kinds of like innovative, when you have a world, when you have such a degree of complexity that isn't dominated by some kind of narrative hegemony, as we were talking about in the presentation, like complexity breeds arbitrage. Like where you have complexity, you have friction, which means that the value of things across the line of friction presents an opportunity for arbitrage. And so, like, while I understand that Roblox, you know, in this particular a document that you referenced on The Guardian, like, is Roblox funded by a child labor industry of children? Sort of, in that it is funded by a software as a service economy of people kind of adopting a sort of neat mentality and living within the Roblox land. That's sort of how I see it. They are actually far less than pure laborers. They're actually like enterprising entrepreneurs within the Roblox land, finding little like situations of contingency and friction and creating arbitrage networks against those spaces. The same is true in games like Minecraft as well. Any game that's kind of sufficiently big like this will breed all kinds of new and crazy entrepreneurial environments. The only difference between Roblox and the rest of the world of games is that, well, it's more marketed explicitly to children, but I can show you probably 500 YouTube videos about Robux arbitrage that is, you know, handled by adults. Your other question, Diana, about open source hardware, I think is sorry, open source software, I think is really interesting. If you're down to ask that one.
Yes, I mean, as you talk about all these presentations, I just think about all these news or things that I consume because I stay a lot in the internet. And my only answer and hope is this type of volunteer-based open software. So I think when we're talking about leadership or how we can come together and counter this, I'm just thinking about the cyber attack that happened in AO3. And again, it's something that have you look into as well.
Yeah, Roberto, I'm happy to go off on open source, but maybe you have a response.
No, go for it, man.
So this is why I'm so critical of platforms, because when we all see platforms as these, again, like these kind of monolithic spaces, and we see code bases as like monolithic objects, and we see open source as this like, you know, revolutionary situation where a bunch of you know, good-hearted, gentle people get together and build something truly collaboratively. That one of the best examples being Midjourney, right? Like, I mean, that's like the origin story of Midjourney. So open source is like, definitely there is a lot of opportunity and interest in open source, and a lot of people have flagged open source as like a revolutionary pathway out. But open source, I see it as actually one of those microeconomies that's generated on top of friction and complexity, because open source code is a modular assemblage of other open source and sometimes closed source code. So, and it typically requires a whole bunch of different, you know, platform-like modular services to deploy, to run, to develop. I mean, it's, and in their like best case scenarios, they develop into, you know, large scale behemoths against which further microeconomies develop and bud. I see them more as like little kind of, not little, sorry, big or little gusts of tornadoes that are kind of moving through another kind of random landscape. Like they move randomly as well. There's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of cyber attacks that come from non-open source communities, right? There's a lot of cyber attacks that come from Wells Fargo. So yeah, just kind of flagging, like, I don't see revolutionary potentiality in open source. Though I do see a lot of interest, especially because there is, to some extent, a decoupling of sheer application-driven development, right? Like use case-driven development. At the same time, like a lot of open source tech is actually the place at which the feedback loop between the social and the computational is moving fastest and most acutely. So I would also raise that as kind of problematic, as in a kind of downscale-y sort of way.
Yeah, and Diana, I share your concerns, and I think about this quite often. and I think it would probably take us time to reframe some of this questioning. But I mean, what we've presented today, it takes a kind of slightly different approach to you know to what's going on as a kind of general framing. So I think some of these questions are quite difficult to answer and would probably require more.
I
sustained
can
thinking.
hear the 3:30 a.m. in your
The
voice.
battery
There's a
running off.
Shall we maybe Reza, do you want to kind of help us conclude this?
Yes, no, absolutely magnificent, absolutely one of the most wonderful lectures, absolutely, I have ever seen presentations by all definitions. I think that foreign object, all of us, I think we can say that bravo, right? Magnificent. The only thing that I have here is that, yes, there is something quite phenomenal here. That, yes, as you say that, the open source paradigm is not exactly the best paradigm for emancipatory practice. And I have thought about this recently in a completely different context, in the context of history, right? And particularly philosophical leaders who usually give rise to tyrants, precisely because philosophy has the capacity to go and reveal the source code of history for everyone to know, except that maybe this is not a really good practice to put the source code online so everyone can hijack it and make tyrants of history, right?
It's a kind of Second Amendment argument, right? If you just give everyone a gun, then society will be safe.
Yes, soon it becomes becomes an ISIS society.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Reza. Thank you for an object. It's truly an honor to have been here, and it's been.
I mean, Safida has done and More has done magnificent job.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you all.
Thank you.